Hello, everyone.
Hi, hi. Already mixing German and English. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, be careful. That went dangerously close to higher. Oh, this is already demonetized. Oh my god. Alright, guys. This is the map. This time I did not put the actual scenarios on the map because, first of all, they're relatively easy to find where this stuff happened. And if anybody's interested, I can actually show you. This time it will be a little bit more about what was the actual planning in the grand scheme that the Germans were doing here, or not doing here, as we'll see. And then we'll do a little bit of tactics with Brock, I believe, but this time it's less tactics, it's more experience, right?
Yeah, I just did some experiments and tried to find out what actually determines how much experience you get, and I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, we'll absolutely take a look at that. We'll also take a look at what our core changes will be based on historical setups of the Panzer divisions for 1942. I haven't really set anything up yet totally, completely. I think a little bit for Demiansk because that is already 42, but I don't know if I'm finished yet. But we'll go into that, and then I will also go, and that will probably the biggest part, into some misconceptions about Barbarossa, the entire campaign, what happened here, what people believe happened, what even some big historians continually repeat, but it's absolutely wrong. So we'll go into that. So I guess we'll start quickly with the pretty much the setup here. So as you can see, ignore that these pictures are a little bit messed up. For some reason, Squirrel Maps always does that to my stuff here. But I have the pictures of the commanders here. We have 3 army groups. I think most of us are aware of that for Barbarossa. We have North, Center, and South. North was under command of von Leeb, and then we have a couple of armies and panzer groups. The Panzer Group 3 is actually not part of North. That is already, that and the 9th Army are already part of Army Group Center. The Panzer groups, you can imagine, pretty much, even though they're named groups, they're pretty much already kind of armies, a little bit smaller than armies maybe. Later on, 2 Panzer groups were unified, and that was then named a Panzer Army. But it's definitely larger than a corps, a little bit smaller than an army, so it's somewhere in between. But it's in principle a small army. Those things basically had all the motorized stuff. They had the motorized infantry divisions and they had the panzer divisions. Every normal army that you see here has no motorized stuff. They're just foot infantry. Maybe some cavalry here and there, but mostly completely unmotorized stuff. We have 2 panzer groups in Army Group Center. One is under command of Guderian, the other is under command of Hoth. And then we have 1 panzer army or panzer group in the south, which is under command of von Kleist. And Rundstedt is put in command of Army Group South. As you remember, he was also in command of the Southern Army Group in the Battle for France. So what was the original idea here? Well, there were basically a lot of planning games, a bit of studies made even at 1940 already on how this could be done. One was actually done by Paulus, our guy that we'll definitely run into again in 1942. He did one study, and he was actually the one that came up not only with a plan, but he also then made a war game and tried to figure out, okay, if we do it like this, what would be the potential problems that we could run into? And he actually came up with a lot of problems, but as the well, there seems to be some opinion in the army that's going around and also was formulated after the war that the guy wasn't exactly a very strong character and that he bent to Hitler's will basically at any moment. So he did find a lot of problems, but he didn't really strongly voice them. because he was just a little bit of a yes man and didn't really want to cause any trouble. Whether that is any true, whether that was really his character, well, people also say he had a weak character because after he was captured in Stalingrad, he later worked for the Soviets, so he kind of switched sides, just always doing what was best for him personally. Whether that is really true, whether that is really his character, we of course cannot say, but it was definitely so that there was in fact a lot of information before all of this happened, months in advance, even in 1940, that this was going to be a problem. They saw that if the Soviets didn't react the way they wanted them to react, this was going to cause trouble. That there was trouble with the initial estimation of the Soviet strength, that there was trouble, that they completely neglected what was actually happening in the Soviet Union as general development since the last time they checked it out, which was basically World War I. So what were those problems that they talked about? Or rather, let's go into what the plans were. The plans were actually mostly always kind of the same. There was initially a plan with 2 army groups. I think Paulus' plan was based on a second study that already used 3 army groups, and they basically always had the same goals. So the Northern Army Group was going to go to St. Petersburg, the Southern Army Group was always going to go into the Ukraine, and with a Central Army Group missing, those would then be kind of swing around, and after they achieved their targets, they would go for Moscow. But at that point, in the 3 army group setup, of course, you would go for the center army group directly for Moscow. But in general, the idea was always, first of all, to go for Leningrad and the Ukraine first and Moscow last. And also, there wasn't really any formulation on really any strategic targets. These things, Ukraine, Moscow, St. Petersburg, were not, or St. Petersburg, I'm saying, back then Leningrad, they didn't really formulate them as, oh yeah, we're going to take those and that's going to defeat the Soviets. No, that was just more of a general direction. Yeah, we're just going to go there and then we're going to take it and we'll just keep going, I guess. And oftentimes the final line of advance was pretty much formulated as the famous Astrakhan Archangel line. If you want to know where that actually is, Astrakhan, I think some people know from the original Panzer Corps and Panzer General campaign. That is this target here that is on the Stalingrad map, where you go down here and there you have a target there, and I think you go even a little bit past that towards this city. But this is basically Astrakhan. It's basically where the Volga flows into the what is this, the Caspian Sea. So from there to Archangel. Where the hell is Archangel? Well, Archangel is basically over here. So this is Leningrad, that is Archangel. So that is basically a line. Let me try and draw that for you here. Let's make that a little fatter. That's a line that goes all the way like that. That was Archangel, right? No, there's Archangel actually over there, so it's even further. So if you look at this, and at this point you're not thinking, are you completely insane? We're gonna do that in 6 weeks? Oh yes, that was the plan. This was supposed to be the final line of advance in 1941. Not like at the end of the war, this was supposed to be done by winter. Starting in 22nd of June. So basically you have about 3 months and then this is done. And they actually expected to be done with this. And I have to emphasize, this is not what Hitler comes up with. No, this is all army. This is all army. So if someone said Hitler had this crazy plan and the army constantly told him, we don't want to do this and this is crazy, that is one of the myths. That is complete garbage. The army designed these plans, the army made plans on how to do this, and they came up with this stuff. They came up with this final line of advance. And whenever there was some issues with, like, how do we get there? How do we actually get supplies there? Are you sure we're actually going to be able to advance there? That's incredibly difficult, and blah, blah, blah. There was basically Halder and Brauchitsch and whoever was in command at the higher levels basically said, oh, don't worry about it. By the time that becomes a problem, we'll have defeated the Red Army anyway, and then we can advance the rest of the way by rail. So they actually expected most of this advance to be a railway advance through undisputed country, because by then the Soviet Union has collapsed anyway. When people actually asked, yeah, okay, but what do we do if that doesn't happen? People basically said, don't worry about it. And that was basically the reaction. And that already tells you what the level of strategic planning was that went into this. It was basically absolutely zero. When people say that the German generals of World War II were master craftsmen basically at their job, then you basically have to say the German generals of World War II were on the operational level absolutely fantastic and complete morons at the strategical level. That is really how you have to say it, because that's exactly the case. And historians like Glantz and also another one, let me check here.
I have one question here. Are these actually the same people? Because most of the operations were done by people like Guderian and Rommel, and I'm not sure if those were the people that did the strategic planning.
No. Guderian and Rommel were way further down at this chain. No, I'm talking, well, although they also didn't exactly show themselves as very strategically aware. But I'm talking now about the higher level. I'm talking about Brauchitsch, I'm talking about Halder, basically army command, the head of the army.
Those were people that were not involved in the operational fighting, so...
Well, you can say that, but for example, Halder did have a grasp of what was going on during the Battle of France, and he was very much aware on how to lead that operationally. That was already a little bit of a supply nightmare, and that only worked because supply colonels were, and a certain supply general was absolutely doing a fantastic job. And on top of that, the Germans had the advantage that they could simply run to French gas stations and fuel up their tanks, because they just used that normal fuel, and they actually had refueling capabilities like that. That was a major advantage. If they hadn't had that improvisation skill, they would have already run into major trouble in France. That was already ignored by high command. And this is actually a problem, because ignoring all this stuff for some reason worked, because lower echelon people just took initiative and improvised. And I'm not talking about Guderian. That goes down to company commanders. That goes down sometimes even to individuals that, for example, at Sedan went over the river with about 5 people and took out bunker after bunker to make it possible for an entire division to cross. If that individual initiative hadn't taken place, that would already not have worked. On top of that, if the French hadn't reacted like complete morons, but that is a different story. Operationally, leading the people, even making these large surroundings, that was all great. But thinking about logistics, thinking about what are we actually going to do if the enemy doesn't react the way we want them to? What are we going to do if this plan doesn't work? What do we do if we have to advance further? Can we even do that? All these thoughts were basically never answered. That is actually something where Hitler was often criticized by these generals. But if you actually look at the situation at hand, you gotta say, from today's perspective, Hitler most of the time until later when he had went a little cuckoo, but now that we know that he was actually under drugs the entire time and later got Parkinson's, we don't know how much that played a role later. But early on, until around 1942, he, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, had at least a better grasp. Definitely also not a perfect grasp. He was sometimes completely off the mark also, but he definitely had a better mark on the strategic stuff than his generals. He also made some very bad decisions in this, and I'm going to mention that, but his generals were even less aware than he was about what was actually going on strategically, when the lower echelon commanders were actually very much aware. But even people like Guderian and Hoth often chose to ignore these facts, or at least think, okay, yeah, we know it's bad, but I'm sure we're gonna be able to do it anywhere. But at least they were aware of the problem, where Army High Command completely ignored it and thought they could go for Moscow at a time when that was already pretty obvious that that was going to be impossible. The very low level, the individual division commanders, they were very much aware of what was going on. So if we're talking about the really high level people, the army group commanders, Army Command, Halder, Brauchitsch, and the army group commanders, so Rundstedt and von Leeb here and Bock, there was a major issue. There was a really major issue. Operationally, they led the troops to victories, but they never really, I think Glantz formulated it, they knew how to win battles, but they had no clue how to win the war. And that was a very different thing to what the Allies later did. They did not think so much about individual battles, they actually had the plan to win the war. The Germans really did not have any plan in the Soviet Union, and if you read all the orders, all the planning games, there was never any kind of mention on how do we actually win this war. There was only, okay, yeah, we're going to encircle them here, and then we're going to move there, and then we're going to destroy this front, and after that it's going to be easy. There was never really any plan on where do we need to go, what do we need to take, how do we actually get this government to surrender. No, it was just, okay, we're going to encircle them and that's done. And that shows a very dangerous development, or a very dangerous lack of development in the German-Prussian army history, where basically, since the Prussian times, the large encirclements have always been the method of choice. And that is fine, except after a while, that seemed to become the only thing that the German army ever knew how to do. So as soon as that doesn't work, the German army every time was in trouble. You saw that in World War I, when the Stiefenplan didn't work, they didn't know how to do it, what to do anymore. In France, it amazingly worked. In Poland, it already kinda didn't work. And if the French had reacted to it, the Germans would have been a little bit in trouble, because remember, the original plan to capture all the Polish army the west of the Vistula already didn't work, and they had to swing around even further, which originally they didn't want to do because that moved them further and further away from the Western Front. Thankfully, the French didn't do anything. In the West, that also could have gone wrong, but didn't, thanks to the slow reactions from the French High Command. Here, for the first time, it actually did not work. Or rather, it did work, but it didn't have the expected effect. And at that moment, the German High Command leadership, and you see that in all the reports, even in Halder's diary, became increasingly depressed because they had no clue what to do about it. And that was a major issue with all this planning. They never had any plan on how to actually win this war. They just had a plan on how to win battles. And when that alone wasn't enough, they were completely out of ideas.
Well, that's really amazing, because you would think if it doesn't work, you sit down, think about it, and at least then formulate a plan, but apparently not.
No, they didn't do that. The basic idea, what they originally wanted to do. Well, let me go into a little bit of geography. There's two major rivers that are of really big importance here. You have one, the Dnieper, that is basically the river that Kiev is on. I mean, anybody that played this probably knows that river. It's on tons of maps. That's the big river on most of, especially my branch of the campaign, because I went south towards Kiev. This is basically the Dnieper. It goes from the Black Sea, flows a little bit west, and then Dnipropetrovsk. I think during the European Championship, there was even a football game there. And it was a while ago, but the one that went in, I think it was Ukraine and Russia shared that. No, Ukraine and Poland shared that one, right? Was a while ago. Anybody that doesn't watch soccer probably doesn't even know. But yeah, it swings around, goes towards Kiev, and then it goes all the way up here and ends up to the west of Moscow. So actually, when we start Vyazma, that river that we still need to cross is still the Dnieper, and the river near Smolensk is also still the Dnieper. So that's a very big river. Also a very major target. One of the side tributaries of the Dnieper is the Pripyat. And that thing has so many deltas and so many side smaller rivers that basically forms the giant marsh region. And that's the Pripyat marshes. I think we're all familiar with that from the Soviet campaign, where in the Bialystok-Minsk encirclement we later have to retreat out of the pocket and hide in the Pripyat marshes. That's exactly that area. And since those Pripyat marshes are a large area, it's also, by the way, known that in the very eastern part of that's actually where Chernobyl is. That's also at the edge of those marshes. Since that's an area where panzers are basically completely useless, that was basically in every plan supposed to be the border between the northern sector and the southern sector, and that was the plan in the final plan as well. That's why here you can see I drew a line directly through them. That is the border between Army Group Center and Army Group South, splitting the sectors into a northern sector with 2 army groups and a southern sector with 1 army group. They never intended to go in there. Some people said, well, what do we do if the Soviets sent people in there? And they said, forget about it, they're not going to do that. Even though they made a plan study, I think that was also the one that Paulus did, and they found out that the Soviets would actually be able to transport considerable numbers of troops by rail into that area, and that could become a problem for the flanks. But again, that plan game was completely ignored. So they basically just completely went around those and completely ignored anything that was in there. So this river goes all the way here to Vyazma, Smolensk, that area. And then next to it, we have another river that I always forget the name. Yeah, the Duna River. That basically flows in the opposite direction, in north, to Riga. And then into the Baltic Sea. Or is that already the Gulf of Finland? No, that is the Baltic Sea still. So, between those, there is obviously a gap. And I think there is a city named Orsha here. Yeah, right there. So I think that was even a target on our Smolensk map. That is called the Orsha Gap, because it is a gap between those 2 rivers. And if you now look at the area here, and I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff. Troop movements, pockets, there we go. And then you look at the road system here. And if you go from Warsaw all the way to Moscow, you will probably see that there's a nice road going through Brest, Minsk, Orsha, Smolensk, Vyazma, Moscow. That's exactly why they took that route, because they needed a road. And that is basically called the Panzer Highway. They called it the Panzerstraße or the Panzer Autobahn, sometimes they even called it. Not that that is in any way of that quality, but it's still the best quality road that you have along this route. That's why you have this Brest, Minsk, Smolensk, Vyazma, Moscow line, because that's a road that goes directly through the Orsha Gap and then into Moscow. That's why Army Group Center used that route. So they wanted to basically go towards the river. Guderian was supposed to reach the Dnieper, path was supposed to reach the Tuna, and then they were supposed to close a gap directly at the Orsha Gap. However, when they went forward, there was again in High Command and also from Hitler a little bit of an issue with, okay, you guys are actually going a little fast for our taste. Let's close this gap, this pocket a little bit earlier. And they were ordered to close the gap already at Minsk. Both of them were absolutely not happy with this. But again, in this case, High Command, or in this case actually Hitler, which ordered this, was right. Because had they actually closed this pocket even wider, they would have run into more problems than they already did. Because what most people don't know or realize is, okay, yeah, these pockets were impressive, but they couldn't close them. At least not hermetically sealed. They were leaking like a sieve. They took huge amounts of prisoners here, but also huge amounts escaped because they couldn't close this gap. What was the reason for that? I'm actually going to go into a video from Eastery, and I hope he will not mind that. I put the link to his channel in the video description. And I'm going to show you an animation of pretty much the encirclement of Minsk. Let me see where that happens. Yeah, pretty much here. That's where you can see down there, that's where the encirclement is happening. And I'm waiting for him to move the camera down again. And then you will see potentially what the issue is here. Yeah, this is pretty good. Look at this. The black symbols or the dark gray symbols are mobilized corps. So these are army corps, those are the motorized ones. The Panzer divisions, the motorized infantry divisions. All the light gray ones are infantry corps. Do you notice how far they are away from each other? That was a major problem at this point. The army of the Germans was basically consisting of two armies. You had one motorized army that went super fast, and you had one army that was basically on the level of World War I that was marching on foot with horses all the way behind. At some points, the motorized divisions were 400 kilometers ahead of the infantry divisions. So when you see these large front lines that move quickly through Russia, those are complete garbage. Because, yes, that's where the Panzer divisions are, but there are huge gaps between those Panzer divisions that are not controlled by anybody. The infantry army that can actually build up a solid front line is 400 kilometers further behind. And that was an issue. When the Panzers went all around these pockets, the sides and the west part could not be closed yet because the infantry divisions were still 100 kilometers away. So until those could get there and actually close these pockets, there were people escaping left, right, and center. And this is where the typical behavior that they had established in France and were actually later commended for, completely not following orders and doing whatever they want, even if High Command gives them completely different orders, which is exactly what happened in France. Rommel basically did whatever he wanted, Guderian basically did whatever he wanted, and they constantly disobeyed orders left, right, and center. They did the same thing here. Guderian was ordered to close the fucking gap, and he pulled out unit after unit from the closing of the gap and sent them on the offensive already, which led to massive amounts of Soviet troops escaping this gap. He just didn't think he was going to be ordered to stay here. No. Okay, you can order me that, and I'm just gonna act like I'm actually leaving people here, but on the quiet, I'm just gonna pull some division out without telling anybody, and I'm gonna send them for advanced recon, or however I'm gonna call it. Exactly the same crap that happened in France happened here again, and this time it actually cost them. Yes, these losses that the Soviets took here were impressive, but they were not impressive enough. they could have gotten a lot more of the people in here, and the units that escaped caused trouble later. The two speeds of the army, as Glantz called it, also became a major issue here. In France, you had relatively short distances. That wasn't so much of a big problem. Also, the French didn't exactly react to it very fast. The Soviets did react very fast, and they tried to break these things out all the time. They attacked left, right, and center because the Soviets had basically a pre-war doctrine that if they are attacked, they're gonna immediately counterattack in full force everywhere, and that's exactly what they did. Did they have a lot of success with that initially? No, not at all. Because it was uncoordinated. The Germans were very, very good at cutting supply lines, cutting communication lines and everything, and Soviet high command half the time didn't even know what was going on. But they still ordered these counterattacks, and even though they were not successful, they certainly gave the Germans a bloody nose, and they caused attrition right from the start. Also, what the Germans didn't expect was that the Soviets were going to be a little bit crazy. Any normal army that got surrounded by the German army in the past and realized we're never going to get out of here surrendered. The Soviets didn't do that. They kept fighting to the last bullet. So they had to meticulously reduce these pockets with fighting armies until these guys finally didn't have anything to fight with anymore. These guys just wouldn't surrender. So they had to stay here and fight these guys, and that also cost them. Every one of these pockets had to be hard fought for and over weeks had to be reduced. That hadn't happened in the West. These guys just surrendered. Soviets, they didn't. They kept fighting until they couldn't fight anymore. That was a big problem because that also delayed them, and that meant they couldn't advance any further until these pockets were reduced. Sure, at some point there were enough infantry armies here and they finally could pull the Panzer armies out again and kept them going. But you still cannot really advance until the armies behind you are done, because before they are done, they cannot follow you, and you cannot just advance knowing the infantry can't follow immediately. So that was a major issue, and it immediately caused massive losses on the Germans right from the start. Always going to make a little bit of break after I'm done explaining something because I'm expecting there to be quite a number of questions.
Not so far. It's okay. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear, so no questions, no.
Yeah, just watching the chat here. To me, any plan that was not 3 years long is useless. Yeah, for a country the size of Russia, as you will see, even that would have been useless, basically. If they had done any proper planning, they wouldn't have done it. Funnily enough, when they actually found out how many tanks the Soviets actually had, which was even more than Guderian had estimated in his book, Panzer, Achtung Panzer or something like that, he had talked about Russia and how many tanks they actually have. And he even put that number a little bit down because he didn't want to look, well, too stupid in that book and overestimate something, so he estimated them at around 10,000. They actually had 24,000, but whatever. Hitler later said, if I had known that the numbers in your book were actually right, I would probably never have done this. That is a quote that he actually said. I think I heard that quote. He actually, I think, commented later that he would have, but on the other hand, he would have felt obliged to do it anyway because there was no other option. But that was the ideological part speaking. But the first part at least made it clear that, yeah, Hitler was very scared of this once he found out that that was actually the situation. And I think that second part of that sentence he only said because at that point it was already too late and he didn't want to look stupid as the Führer in front of his generals. So saying, well, I would have had to do it anyway, so. But I think he might actually not have done this, at least not at that time, had he known what the actual situation was. The Soviets at this time had more tanks than the rest of the armies of the world combined. same is true for the Air Force. They had more planes than any Air Force in the world combined. Let that sink in for a minute. That was the situation. Yes, a lot of that stuff was old crap. But even the old crap, you first have to shoot and kill. And even a T-26 can cause some trouble if it rushes into infantry. So, that was a major issue. Now, another issue that arose here was not just that the Panzer armies were so far ahead of the infantry armies. There was also immediately, it was also immediately obvious that this was going to be a little bit of a problem for supplies. Not only was it pretty obvious that the supply situation was going to be crap anyway, because, well, we all know about the railway problem. And a lot of times it's quoted like, okay, yeah, it's a different gauge, but you had these building troops and they went ahead and relay the railway with a different gauge, and they just moved over the track and stuff like that. Yeah, that's not that easy. That's not all you need to do. First of all, they never expected to actually need to do this. Because as I mentioned, every time someone mentioned a problem, they said, don't worry about it, we're gonna make this. The original plan was, oh yeah, it's no problem, we're just gonna capture all the Russian locomotives. Of course, the Russians weren't so stupid. They took all the locomotives and pulled them away. Not only that, they also destroyed a number of railway networks, and on top of that, they also destroyed very important stuff like water towers and everything else that steam locomotives need. And even if they didn't do that in places, it was still a problem because the Russian locomotives were built for Russia, meaning they actually expected to go over very long distances. The German locomotives needed water at shorter intervals, and there weren't enough water towers in that short amount of intervals along those rail lines. So not only did you have to relay the gauge, you also had to build all this equipment, all these buildings that steam locomotives need along the way. Water towers, all their service stations, all the stuff that you need. They had to rebuild all that stuff also. And that takes a huge amount of time. At the same time, thanks to Guderian's push for rapid motorization, they had changed the doctrine mostly to go away from railway supply and a little bit more towards motorized supply, meaning trucks. But they didn't have enough trucks. They didn't even have enough rubber to replace the tires of the trucks. They actually estimated that 4 weeks into the campaign, Germany would run out of rubber. So, what was the situation here then? Well, it basically meant that because they kind of went the middle way and couldn't really decide on anyone, neither was actually adequate. They couldn't supply the army properly by rail, and they couldn't supply it properly by truck. So they had to kind of use both a little bit, and it still wasn't enough. That was a major issue. At the same time, and I'm gonna open this and you can read it for yourself, but I'm also gonna read it to you. As I mentioned, Germany did not have enough trucks. And let me actually close this and move it to the other screen because I want to mention something else first. Because I mentioned that already back in France. Remember that? When I said Germany actually figured out that they couldn't build replacement parts for truck as quickly as they needed them because the vehicles were breaking down in the army quicker than they could replace them. Well, that meant that in front of the engagement of France, Halder, the chief of staff of the army, ordered a demotorization of the army. Yes, a demotorization. And they had a similar thing happening after the Battle of France because they simply could not keep all those trucks running. If you have 1% of trucks being, falling out because something breaks in them, as it happens with vehicles, and you can only produce enough spare parts and new vehicles to replace about 0.5% or even less, I think, per month, then that's an issue. So they actually demotorized. So what did they do after 1940 to fix that problem? Well, After 1940, you have basically occupied half of Scandinavia, and you have occupied the Benelux countries and France. So those guys have trucks, right? Okay, so we're going to capture all of those. And we're going to use them to supply the army with. We're also going to take some Czech trucks from those factories. We're all going to throw that into the army. Well, that sounds great, right? We have a huge amount of trucks. Yes, you have a huge amount of trucks. The problem is you also have a huge amount of type of trucks. And let me quickly get to that quote. Yes, the trade-off for, and I'm quoting from David Style, he's a guy from Australia, I believe. Very, very good historian also of Barbarossa and in general the Eastern Front. You should look him up. I'm not sure that he's Australian, but I think so. The trade-off for alleviating the immediate strain on resources was a further exacerbation of the standardization problem, which had grown so out of proportion that by the launch of Barbarossa, some 2,000 different types of vehicle were in service, and Army Group Center had alone had to stock and distribute over 1 million different types of spare parts.
Oh my god, that sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah. The 18th Panzer Division, for example, fielded no fewer than 96 different types of personnel carriers, 111 types of trucks, and 37 different types of motorcycle. If you look at these numbers and listen to these numbers, you can imagine that this was an absolute nightmare. How on earth can you supply an army like that? Not only do you already have a supply problem of getting this stuff to the front, no, the stuff that you get it to the front with is also a supply issue, the trucks. On top of this, you have another problem. Not all of these trucks that they requisitioned were actually army-type trucks. They were not supposed to be all-terrain vehicles. Most of these trucks were civilian trucks. There were trucks that are supposed to run on roads. And if you put these in these miserable conditions in Russia, where roads are basically a sand strip that is in no way a actually fortified road in Western European standards, these things break down left, right, and center. So you're actually issuing a much bigger problem to the army than you're actually solving, because now you have columns trying to go along a road where left and right of the road you can absolutely not march with anything you're pulling, because yeah, everything will get stuck. And if one of those vehicles breaks down on this road, it's so narrow that overtaking is basically impossible. There are actually after action reports that talk specifically about this. There's no way of overtaking anything. So if anything breaks down in front of you, the entire column is down, because nothing can move anymore until that vehicle is repaired or it's pushed off the road. On top of this, there's another myth. We all remember, oh yeah, the German army went forward like crazy, right? Until that damn October autumn weather started, right? Oh my god, at that point everything turned into mud and then it was suddenly over. Nope. After I read these books and I actually looked into it, guess what I found out? That is a complete myth. They had that problem right from day one. Not so much the mud, although that also happened. These were sandy roads that were not fortified. In July, they had the occasional day of rain, and they mentioned when you usually had a sunny day that had 40 degrees centigrade, no idea what that's actually in Fahrenheit, let me figure it out. 40 centigrade. If anybody happens to know that, you can also put it in the chat. That is about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So that was the average temperature in July. Then you had a rainy day, which immediately turned this into a complete mess of mud. Everything got stuck, everything sunk in, and now it was even worse. Because now, the next day, you had sunny weather again at 40 degrees. And that basically baked this stuff solid. If you had a vehicle stuck in there until that point, you basically had it stuck in concrete, basically. There was almost no way to get that out again. And that was happening from day one. And even if it was sunny, again, these were sandy roads. What happens if you have a huge column of vehicles go forward on a sandy road? You have huge dust clouds everywhere you look. Not so much that that's an issue of being seen. That apparently wasn't such a major issue. I mean, these huge columns are going to be seen anyway. But foot soldiers had to march through this crap. They said 40 degrees with this stuff in your eyes, in your face. You couldn't see anything. It stuck in your eyes. It stuck in your throat. You're completely miserable. Then the horses also had to go through this stuff. These are horses that are used to conditions in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, at these temperatures, with this miserable stuff, dust in their eyes, dust in their throats, these horses were not up to this. They died by the thousands. Not only couldn't they feed the horses properly because the stuff that they were used to, high protein food that they were getting them, special kind of special kind of grass and hay. I'm not sure what the English word for it is, but there was special kind of food for horses that they needed to be fed with. They didn't have that in Russia, so these horses all died. What happens now? Okay, you're now not only on a shitty road in high degree temperatures where every now and then there's mud and muck and all miserable conditions. Now your horse died and you have to pull your stuff by hand. And you see that in pictures of summer 1941, where soldiers, basically 2 soldiers, pull all the guns, all the 37 pucks and all that stuff, because the horses all have died. They requisitioned Russian horses, but yeah, they only could do that so much. So the horses die, the trucks break down. The trucks and the Panzers are reported to have 10 times the amount of oil usage because the dust gets in all the air filters and in the engines, and the engines all die. And they use huge amounts of oil that the Germans have not enough of anyway. So this is a miserable situation right from the start. But somehow they still make it, they still push forward, but they have huge losses, they have huge amount of vehicle breakdowns, and it's miserable. By the time they reach Smolensk in August and stuff, there are reports of commanders that they say the morale is at an all-time low. This constantly going, this immense scale of landscape, where you basically have no idea how far do I need to go until this is over. It just doesn't stop. We keep pushing forward hundreds of kilometers and there's no end in sight. People are miserable. People are breaking down. There are reports about soldiers having crying fits and nobody being able to console them. These people are on their last breaths already at the end of summer, because these conditions are just insane. On top of this, because the motorized divisions were so far ahead and were basically bypassing everything that a Panzer division cannot deal with, like large forest areas, swampy areas, towns that are too difficult to take, we'll just keep pushing forward. Let the infantry do that. So the infantry goes a couple of 100 kilometers behind. Now what happens between those two front lines? Well, basically nothing. There's Soviet troops in there that got bypassed. So if you hear about early partisan activity, those are not partisans. Those are regular Soviet army troops that have just been bypassed. Nobody cared about them. So they find themselves stuck in a forest. The Germans have moved past them. The next German line is coming. So they fortify themselves in the forests and these swamp areas. And what do? Well, you're cut off from your own guys. You're not getting any supplies. So what do you do to get food? And further ammunition maybe, but mainly food. Well, there's German supply columns going through that area because they have to reach the German Panzer divisions, right? So they attack the German supply columns left, right, and center. So the German supply columns that have to reach the motorized divisions basically have to go through unsecured country. There's tons of Soviet troops in these areas, in forests, deep forests that first have to be liberated, and the infantry is complaining that they basically have to clear every single scrap of forest, every single town, every single swamp, everything, because these guys just don't surrender. They just take the supplies from the Germans and keep going. Why should they surrender? The Germans are basically delivering them supplies for free, so we're fine. We're living in this area. Our town where we were born is next door over there. We keep fighting. So they have this situation, Soviet troops all over the place that have just been bypassed, and the follow-up front has a hard job of actually dealing with all of those. And this is a huge front line. Clearing all of this seems almost completely impossible. And that's your major issue. You have already not enough supplies. You have major issues getting those supplies forward. And now your supply lanes are getting attacked by the troops that you bypassed. This is a major issue and a major pain in the ass. So that gives you, I think, a picture of what the German army was actually facing here. It is completely insane. And when we said earlier, well, you would think that if initially that first encirclement doesn't work, we're going to sit down and think about what we're going to do next. Yeah, that would probably be the intelligent solution for that. But what the Germans basically did here was, okay, thinking there's going to be a front line of the Soviets. We're going to break through that, encircle it, destroy it, and then we're done. But that doesn't happen. There's another front line building up. Well, then we're going to break through that and encircle that and defeat that, and then we're going to be done. But there's another front line developing, so we're going to break through that and encircle that, and that keeps going and going and going and going. First we break through near Minsk, then we break through near Smolensk, then we break through at Vyazma, and then we break through at Moscow, and by that time we don't have anything to fight with anymore. That's basically what they did. When the first plan didn't work, they tried to repeat the same plan again and again and again and again. Yeah. Until they ran out of stuff. That's basically what happened here. After Minsk, most of the panzer divisions were already down to 50% strength in panzers. After Smolensk, they were down to 30% of panzers. After Vyazma, some panzer divisions had 7 tanks. And they still went for Moscow. So if anybody believes that Moscow would have been possible, no. There is a basic principle of the German military strategic mind, Clausewitz, that probably everybody has heard of. There's a principle that every attack at some point runs out of steam. And when that happens, an immediate counterattack will always follow. So if you push your attack until you run out of steam, you will run into that counterattack. You have to stop your attack before that happens. Otherwise, you get overwhelmed. And that is exactly what specifically the Germans, and Clausewitz is a German, or was a German, they ignored. They kept going until they didn't have anything anymore, in the vain hope that, okay, the last 3 breakthroughs didn't destroy the Soviet Union, maybe the 4th one will, right? Because why not? They went into this until they didn't have anything anymore. Then the inevitable major counterattack came and almost destroyed the entire Army Group Center, because that Army Group Center did almost not have anything to fight with anymore. Richard Martin, only possible if they didn't murder Russian and ask them to join the Germans in taking out Stalin. But if Germany did that, they wouldn't be following Nazi doctrine. Yeah, that was actually a nice anecdote that I read in one of these books. As I mentioned, there's huge supply problems, right? Your supplies are getting intercepted or not reaching at all. You have situations where actually some trucks from divisions, from the supply column of a Panzer division, has to drive from the front 500 kilometers back to Germany, pick up supplies, and drive 500 kilometers back. That's what they sometimes had to do. How long a truck survives doing that, you can imagine. In this situation, they lose their horses, they don't have their supplies, so what do? Well, you plunder the surroundings, because that's the only thing you can do. So you steal the horses from the farmers, you steal the supplies, the food, the equipment, whatever you can get your hands on from the Soviet population. And yeah, you see that sometimes in videos about the wars, you have that one guy in your unit that can always find something. You know, he vanishes and suddenly turns up with 3 chickens and a pig, right? Yes, that's exactly what happened here, except they took that from the civilian population, which suffered a lot from this. And the funny anecdote was, there is actually apparently a report from the SS, of all people, that is complaining that the German army plundering of this population is actually turning the Soviet population against Germany. The SS is complaining about the army turning the population against them. It's gone that far.
Yeah, it's never that easy.
That's exactly what is happening here. It's not just that they're killing people. That is happening behind the front. No, at the front, it's already the German troops plundering left, right, and center and stealing everything from the people that are poor farmer folk anyway. That is turning the people already against Germany. Once it becomes clear that there are murder troops coming behind, it becomes, of course, even worse. But this is already doing the job. There are people indeed welcoming the Germans, not so much the Russians, because we're not in Russia yet, but the Ukrainians, the White Russians, yeah, absolutely. They're not exactly fan of the Bolsheviks. And even some of the partisans that are later fighting are basically fighting against everybody. They don't like the Bolsheviks and they don't like the Nazis, so they basically fight against everybody. So not all of them are pro-Stalin or something like that. There's also troops that just hate both of them. Initially, they just hate the Bolsheviks, then they figure out that the Nazis are also assholes, so they fight them all. These are different groups. It's not necessarily so much an organized resistance of partisans. That happens a little bit later, 1943, 1944. This early stuff is very disorganized. It's cut off troops. It's civilians that are fed up with the Soviets and the Nazis. It's stuff like that. But yes, if they had recruited some of these people, maybe, but yeah, I actually don't believe so, because now I'm gonna drop the next bomb onto you and tell you how incredibly insane these Soviets actually were. Initially, well, let me actually read to you what the Germans actually accomplished here. Employing blitzkrieg tactics, Hitler's panzers thrust up to 600 kilometers or 360 miles into the Soviet heartland in the first 3 weeks of the war, gobbling up most of Belarusia and large segments of the Baltic region and the Ukraine. The Wehrmacht demolished the Red Army's first strategic echelon, encircled and swallowed up the bulk of the Western Front west of Minsk. A front is kind of an army group. And reached the Dnieper River along the Moscow axis. In the process, it tore the heart out of the Red Army, inflicted at least 747,000 casualties, including 588,000 killed, wounded, or missing, roughly 1/6 of the Red Army's June 1941 strength, and eliminated 10,000 Red Army tanks and 4,000 aircraft in 3 weeks. By any measure, this victory was indeed both unprecedented and astounding. So why did this not work? Well, first of all, what happened to the factories? In total, 1,523 factories, including 1,360 related to armaments, were transferred to the Volga, Siberia, and Central Asia between July and November 1941. Almost 1.5 million freight cars were involved. Even allowing for the hyperbole so common to Soviet accounts, this massive relocation and reorganization of heavy industry was an incredible accomplishment of endurance and organization. addition for me, especially if you consider that during this operation they never stopped production. There was always armaments produced somewhere. That was the first incredible thing that the Soviets pulled off. The Germans also completely underestimated what that area around the Volga, so in the way behind in the Urals region, actually looked like. They thought Russia still looked like in the First World War. That basically until Russia in the European part, you basically have a relatively developed country, but anything after that is just steps and non-developed country. At this point, that was no longer the case. The entire area along the Volga was very much developed already, had armaments industry, had very developed cities and infrastructure and all that kind of stuff, relative to the rest of Russia, obviously. So they originally ignored that they needed to take that to win this, and not just Moscow. There was still a lot of developed Russia that would have been able to resist even further behind that. They ignored that. And if it got mentioned, because some people actually knew about this, that had been to Moscow, and there was actually some former attaché to Moscow that had actually lived there, he knew that. It got all ignored and said, yeah, by that time it's going to be over anyway, and then we'll take that by rail, no problem. Okay. So you get this stuff out of the way. You completely ignore that stuff is developed, and now comes the big bomb. The Soviets had an absolutely crazy idea of what modern war was going to be like. But that idea not only came true, it actually saved their ass. Bear with me here. The Soviets had a pre-war doctrine that expected and required that the army would have to be completely replaced every 4 to 8 months. I'm going to repeat that. The army would have to be completely replaced every 4 to 8 months. That means every guy, every gun, every tank, every shell, everything. Every 4 months. You build an entirely new army. Not one army on the battlefield, your entire army. Every 4 to 8 months. That's what they were expected to need to do. That's what they trained to be able to do. And that meant that in the 1930s and the late 1920s, they had a massive military conscription program. And that enabled them to have, at the point of the German invasion, a pool of 14 million men with at least basic military training. And a lot of trained reservists that they could immediately turn into working divisions. Of course, they needed to be equipped, but they had 14 million trained men to pull from. Nobody in the entire world had anything like that. What was the consequence of this? Despite heavy losses, these additions brought the Red Army's line strength to 401 division equivalents in 1st August, 450 division equivalents on 1st September, 592 division equivalents on 31st December. At the same time, the Army's personnel strength rose from 5.3 million on 22nd June to 6.8 million on 31st of August and an estimated 8 million on 31st December. In this time, the Germans have basically eliminated 5 million Soviet troops all along the front, north, center, and south. They have destroyed 5 million Soviet troops until December. Despite that, the Red Army actually grew in size by 3 million. And now tell me how much of a chance the Germans have to win this. You destroy 5 million troops, the entire Red Army. They had 5 million at the beginning. You destroy basically all of that. And they grow in size by another 3 million to 8 million. That's what happened here. And now tell me how they were supposed to win this. There's absolutely no chance. Absolutely none. If you think, oh yeah, if they had taken Moscow, this would have been over. Nah. Then you're falling into the same trap, or you actually are thinking about what you read, what the German generals were saying. They were stuck in this thinking, the next breakthrough is gonna do it. No. The first one didn't do it, the second one didn't do it, the third one didn't do it, and the fourth one for sure would not have done it either. Absolutely not. Actually, that push to the south that Guderian did actually trapped another 700,000 troops. And that not only made the southern flank of Moscow completely open, it also gave the Soviets enough time in front of Smolensk to keep attacking the Germans until they themselves went completely out of steam and fell into the same Clausewitz trap and exhausted their offensive strength. And then the Germans actually had a relatively clear path towards Moscow until they ran into all those reserve divisions that had been again mobilized to be put in front of Moscow. But they were never going to win this, no matter what they did. That's why Kiev and that decision is basically irrelevant. You can even argue that it was actually the best thing they could do at the time, because it actually, operationally, it put them into a better position. But strategically, there was just no way in hell they were going to win this. So I'm going to let that sink in, because I know these were incredible numbers, and it's actually mind-boggling on what the Soviets did at this time. And I'm going to let that sink in, and then I'm going to show you something else. Any questions about this so far?
Well, not really questions, I think, but some comments. But yeah, it's, I think, pretty clear. The only thing you can debate, I think, is about the decision Moscow or Kiev, but
yeah, I will go actually into that a little bit.
That's not really how to win, but what at least gives you I don't know, 2.2% chance of something crazy happening with the Soviet regime, but not really winning on the battlefield, of course. I made a video about this. It's just,
yeah, I watched it. Yeah,
on a strategic level, just looking at the distances and the things involved, I think one of the misconceptions here is that going towards the south shortens the front line. What it actually doesn't do, I think, because from Smolensk to Kiev, it's a really long way, and I think almost double the distance to Moscow, and it's going right through the marshes, so you can't supply. The supply has to go behind the army, and that very much will make your supply situation even more difficult, I think.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go into that really quickly. I will read a quote about that after I'm done, because some of the historians, especially David Stahel, is of the opinion that Kiev was actually not important at all, no matter what they would have done, but that in the situation, it was still the better choice. I'm actually going to go into that why. First of all, after Smolensk, there was actually a major trouble. Let me actually go into the 1941 video again and go a little bit forward towards Smolensk. So this is the Smolensk pocket, right here. You can see that right there. Smolensk is right in there. At least that's Smolensk. You can't see the city because there's divisions all over it, but this is the Smolensk pocket, basically east of Orsha. You can see my cursor on this, right? I don't think the stream has advanced until there, but
yeah, I can see it.
Okay. you can see there is a gap here. That was actually a major issue. The Smolensk gap, I mean, the Minsk gap was at least closed. It had holes all along the way, but it was at least closed. This one didn't close. And that was because Guderian didn't close it. Guderian was of the opinion that they should push further east to have a good advancing point on Moscow. He did not think it was his main job to close this gap. People above got furious, told him, close the fucking gap. And this was even a command situation that was completely messed up. At this point, von Kleist was, I think, he was under command of 4th Army, and he was kind of put now in command of the Panzer groups also. So the Panzer groups now were under his command. And then came the Army Group Commander, and sometimes Guderian and Hoff agreed with the Army Group Commander, but not with Kleist. And so they bypassed each other and had conflicting orders and all kinds of stuff. So the entire chain of command at this point was almost falling completely apart. There was Guderian flying to the headquarters of Kleist, having a huge hissy fit with him and shouting at each other, sometimes even asking, okay, if you don't want this, then relieve me of my command, blah, 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 blah. And then the Army Group Commander had to intervene and say, okay, calm down, guys, don't behave like kindergarten children. And yeah, it was basically characters clashing left, right, and center. And if I can go on a little bit on a tangent here, because I saw a good historical debate about this, what was actually Auftragstaktik and all that kind of stuff. Why is there even Auftragstaktik? Well, it comes from Prussia. You are surrounded, you're a small state, you're military effective, but you're basically always surrounded, so you need to be able to do quick stuff. That's why you need these large encirclement battles to come to a quick victory, okay? In a time where you have horses and cavalry and cannons and basically 18th century stuff, you don't have radios, obviously. So this kind of quick maneuvering doesn't work if you have to wait for commands from above. So you need to have officers that are decisive, that take initiative, and that have their own mind and can follow a goal and not specific ways to achieve that goal. That's how that came to be, because it was just required. And that went over all the way to World War II. The problem with officers like that is, yes, they're independent, yes, they're independent thinkers, but at the same time, that means they hate authority. Because now you have officers that come out of a tradition that has them basically act independently because they cannot wait for orders. Combine that with radio technology, and now you actually can give them quick orders. And that means you have people that don't expect or want orders from above, getting orders from above all the time. That leads to guys like Rommel going Ghost Division and completely ignoring orders and saying, oh, you actually tried to contact me? Oh, for some reason that didn't get to me. Like, I can't hear you. That joke. That's exactly what Rommel did. That's exactly what Guderian did and all these guys. That happens if you have a tradition of leadership that conflicts with now having better communication technology. That's why there is so much trouble in the chain of command at this time. These guys want to be independent. They want to do their own thing. But now they are in constant communication with the guys from above, and that causes him to bump heads all the time. With this in mind, Guderian wanted to push forward. Sometimes the Army Group Commander even wanted to push forward, but Kleist wanted to close the gap first. So basically neither happened very well, and eventually Hoth from Panzer Group 3 in the north got pissed at Guderian because he had achieved his part of the gap closed, but Guderian didn't do his. So Hoth at some point even said, you know what? I could maybe close this gap by pushing further down, but I'm not going to do it because that's not my job. Guderian should do that. So you have even these guys running into each other. Eventually, I think they closed it from the north, but by that time, a huge amount of troops had already escaped again. There's Or there's after action reports talking about this every day. There's basically a division escaping here. That's insane. We need to close this. It's all not going to work. It's insane. Guderian is an asshole and all this kind of stuff. It's completely insane. So the leadership, the Germans had such great leadership and all this. Their chain of command was perfect. Not even close. The German chain of command was an absolute nightmare at this point. Nobody listening to anybody and everybody doing their own thing. At the bottom, they knew that they were running into major problems. At Smolensk, you cannot look at that just the pocket and they're reducing that and everything is fine. No, at this point, Timoshenko is actually launching a major counterattack over this entire time. Normal counterattacks, but also a major planned counterattack, which doesn't work, but puts the Germans into major trouble. At this point, again, the German panzer divisions are down to 30% strength. They are trying to pull the German panzer divisions off the line to refit and replace and rearm them for the next offensive, but they can't do that because the infantry divisions aren't there yet, and even when they're there, they still don't have the firepower, and the offensives from the Soviets are so strong that they need to keep the panzer divisions that are supposed to do offensive operations in defensive positions to keep the front line stabilized. There's breakthroughs left, right, and center that they need to pluck because the Soviets are breaking through, because the infantry divisions are running out of ammunition and all that kind of stuff. At this point, something else happens. Army Group North is stuck a little bit. So one of the air fleets is getting pulled out of Army Group Center and sent north. That means not only is the Air Force or the Luftwaffe not capable of covering this entire ground anymore already, they also now have one entire air fleet less. That means no more air superiority over here. Not even any kind of presence anymore. At this point, east of Smolensk, the Germans don't have the supplies anymore. They don't have supplies for their artillery anymore. That means the artillery cannot engage anymore. They need to save their ammunition for specific targets that they can see. They cannot do barrages anymore. The Soviets at this time, in opposite, are shelling them left, right, and center. By the way, the Soviets have 10 times as much artillery as the Germans. They are shelling them worse than anything the Germans have seen ever, including World War I, and the Germans can't do anything about it. They can't do counter-battery fire because they don't have the ammunition anymore. At the same time, the Soviets have now in this area complete air superiority and are basically bombing them 24/7. The Germans are suffering huge losses here. They don't have the supplies to properly defend. They're basically doing the cannon fodder tactics at this point. They basically defend to the last bullet, to the last man, to be able to somehow hold this front line. At this point, the army commanders here say, this is the end of Blitzkrieg. From now on, it's trench fighting again. Because they see no way with the current supply situation and these massive amounts of attacks from the Soviets and them constantly re-establishing a front line seemingly out of nowhere, they see no way how they can keep going after this. And that's the situation here. When people say at this point, when the leadership decides we're going to go for Kiev, there is no way they could have done Moscow at this time. They do not have the people. The stuff Guderian goes southwards is just a minor part of his panzer group, not the entire thing. The rest of his panzer group has finally been able to get pulled off the line and is now in desperate need of refitting. Most of the tanks are completely out of action. Most of the trucks are completely out of action. At this point, Hitler decides that all the newly produced tanks back in Germany are not going to be sent for the front, but kept in reserve for future operations. The frontline commanders go completely insane, say we need those replacement tanks desperately. Hitler orders, okay, I'm gonna give you at least 400 engines as replacements. They don't do that eventually. He only gives them 150, even though Guderian had said even 400 is way too little. So they can barely even keep their panzer divisions in a running state anymore at this point. At Smolensk, they're in no way, shape, or form able to do any offensive operations towards Moscow in any case. They definitely need several weeks, at least a month in August, and so at least until September, until the panzer divisions are even remotely in any state that they can go on offensive operations anymore. On top of this, there's also this myth that, oh yeah, the original goal was to go for Moscow anyway, and then Hitler suddenly changed his mind. No, that's not true. The original order always said, in front of Moscow, Army Group North and South are going to split up, Army Group Center is going to split up to support Army Group North and South to take Leningrad and the Ukraine. And only after that has been achieved, we're going to go for Moscow with everything. Moscow was always the third most important target in every single order, in every single planning. Halder and Brauchitsch weren't happy with that and tried to bypass this right from the start, never actually telling Hitler because they didn't want to talk to him about this. So they said, yeah, okay, Hitler, your plan is fine. But they said, we just need to make sure that South and North can do their stuff on their own, then Hitler will let us do Moscow. But Hitler noticed, well, apparently North and South are not doing so great. So he ordered them to go north and south. That's actually why Brack went for Leningrad, because Army Group Center was not just sent to Kiev. It was done exactly what had originally been ordered. The northern Panzer Group was supposed to assist the push towards Leningrad, and the southern Army Group, Southern Panzer Group, was supposed to help with the push past Kiev. That was always the plan. But they only sent parts of that, like a Panzer Corps here and a Panzer Corps there. They didn't do that with the entire Panzer Army because these needed to be desperately refitted. So they basically took everything that was still running, sent that south. That was the stuff they could somehow keep supplied. Those were also the panzer divisions that they had been able to pull from off the line earlier. So they had a chance to refit, and they used those to make these moves. Everything else couldn't have been used in either direction because they didn't have any working tanks anymore. All the engines were dead, all the supplies were gone, all the trucks were out of action. Those things were not in any shape or form capable of doing any operations anywhere. So while Guderian and Hoth were doing this north and south operation, their main forces were left there behind the line now that the infantry was actually reaching the front and could take their place. They were being refitted as much as possible, not even close to 100%, because again, Hitler didn't even send them all the stuff they needed. And even if he did, they probably wouldn't have gotten it to the front quickly enough. But they got them at least somewhat in a fighting state, including the trucks, even though reports said, okay, now we have the trucks running, but I can guarantee you once we're going, in 2 days, 50% of them are going to be broken down again, which was exactly what happened. But at least on paper, they had something of a panzer division again. Until that time, there was no way to break through. After those two operations were done, these major counterattacks at Smolensk had exhausted the troops facing the Germans on their way to Moscow. That's why when they actually went to the offensive again, they could easily break those troops because they had exhausted themselves against the German front. If they had done that earlier, those troops would not have been exhausted yet. And at that time, they had all hands full even holding the line, let alone breaking through the Soviets. So that is the situation here. Could they maybe have broken through if the supply situation had been better? Yeah, maybe, but it wasn't. And at that time, they desperately needed to first replace and rearm their panzer divisions. They didn't have them at this time. At the same time, that push would have had major trouble in the south. Initially, when Stalin expected what Hitler would do if they attacked the Soviet Union, he fully expected him to go to the Ukraine first because he agreed with Hitler. So Hitler and Stalin were actually both on the same page here, that the Ukraine was one of the most important parts of the Soviet Union, because a lot of armament industry is there. It's basically the entire food supply and all, and it's on the way to the oil fields. So he put most of the strength of the army down there. The armies in the Ukraine were by far the strongest numerically down there. If that had remained there in the flank of Army Group Center that was already weakened, that would have been a major problem. What they achieved when Guderian broke through, Zhukov actually said, no, this is a nightmare, pull these guys back immediately, Stalin. Stalin said, nope, and sent Zhukov off. He relieved him of command. Later, he actually put him in command of the area, but by that time it was too late. Stalin was stubborn, didn't want to pull these guys back, and that resulted in the strongest part of the front of the Soviets being encircled in the Kiev area. And that basically cleared the way for the entire Army Group South to reach Rostov, to take the Crimea and all that. Had that not happened, the strongest part of the Soviet front would still have been in action. And if then the attack towards Moscow breaks down and runs into a counterattack, it's not only that Army Group Center gets almost destroyed, now you have a major part, the strongest part of the Soviet army still in existence that can also fall in its flank. There is no way, in my opinion, that the Germans would have been able to survive that. So operationally, I think this was the best they could do. It didn't get them any closer to Moscow. However, the southern battles, including the Bryansk battle, cleared basically the way for Guderian to swing around to the south of Moscow. Had that not been done, that southern route would not have been clear. There would have been incredibly strong forces still in the way of the Germans. With this move, they put them all out of the way. With the northern push, they actually came pretty close to Leningrad and almost linked up with the French and managed to encircle Leningrad, which had not happened at this time yet. And even after, and at least after Leningrad had not been taken, but at least fully encircled, that's when Hitler released those troops and let them help at Moscow. Now you may also think, okay, why not go just for Moscow? Why is the north and south so important? Well, strategically, Hitler isn't that far off the mark, because near Leningrad there is actually the base of the Baltic Fleet. If you cut that off, and if you cut all the Baltic states off, you are basically cutting the Soviets off from access to the Baltic Sea. And at the same time, you can use those ports to supply your troops, not through these dysfunctional road networks and rail lines, but you can at least send some stuff to the ports. For some areas of the front, that's still too far away, but at least that northern sector can then be supplied by sea. The same in the south. If you cut off the Soviets from the Ukraine, not only if you cut off the Crimea, you cut off another major naval base, you cut them off from access to the sea there, so you basically cut off the entire Soviet Union from most of their sea access. They don't have any ports anymore. They can't get anything to their ports. So they had to go, all the convoys had to go all the way around to Murmansk. And they also wanted to cut the Murmansk rail line as well together with the Finns, but that just didn't work. But had they managed to do that, there would have basically been no place for the Allies to supply the Soviet Union anywhere in the West. The way they could have done that was supply them all the way in the East, but then they would have to go through very, very dangerous waters controlled by the Japanese to reach anything like Vladivostok maybe, and then those supplies would have to be shipped all the way across the Soviet Union to the West. So this had merit. Cut the access to the sea, enable yourself to have access to the sea. You can use that as a supply, and you basically take the major political center of Leningrad and you take the major industrial center of the Ukraine. Yes, Moscow is a major rail network and a major transport hub basically, but that doesn't mean those other targets are completely unimportant. That is important, and if you take the entire Ukraine, you are on the way to the oil fields, and those oil fields were originally part of the goal that was supposed to be taken. So if you take that strategic goal in mind, taking those first and then Moscow is actually the right way to do. Is it completely idiotic to expect you are going to be able to take all 3 of those and more in 6 weeks? Of course, obviously. But if you think you can take it, that order of doing things is actually not that stupid as you think. That actually makes some strategic sense. At the same time, around this time, Hitler saw what was happening with the encirclements. He saw, okay, my panzer troops are losing offensive strength all the time. At the same time, we don't seem to be able to really close these gaps properly. So what are we going to do? Hitler ordered them not to do these operational level encirclements anymore, but do only tactical level encirclements at this point. Not do these major surroundings anymore, because we can't plug those gaps anyway. So do them small, surround smaller stuff that you at least can make sure that you can actually close. At this point, this actually makes a lot of sense. Guderian and Hoth are furious and don't like this at all. At the same time, they're the ones that are not able to plug the gaps. So Hitler has again the better picture of things. He wants to save the panzer troops, he wants to give them the opportunity to actually resupply, make encirclements that actually they are capable of pulling off, and going slower. Going a little bit away from Moscow, saying, okay, we obviously seem to run into a couple of problems here. Maybe we should step back and go smaller steps, take smaller bites, and make sure that we at least can take those. That makes total sense in this case. That makes total sense in this moment. It actually gives the army some time to breathe, and it still works when they are trying to do this. The first initial encirclements that are the first step for Guderian to push south is actually working. They are making progress that actually gives them breathing room. And the thing that Guderian pulls off in the south, you may wonder now, okay, if he didn't actually go in there with an entire panzer group and just with a couple of corps, like how did he do that if those forces down there were so strong? Well, he did that because Stalin's order prevented any from those troops to actually get in his way. So for the most of his ride down to the south, Guderian is basically completely unopposed until the Soviets actually realize they're in major trouble and try to do something, and at that point it's too late. He didn't run into any major issues here. If Zhukov had gotten his way and would have been able to rearrange some troops and put them in Guderian's way, Guderian would have had no chance of breaking through. No chance in hell. He would have been way too outnumbered down there. But the Soviets made a major strategic blunder here, caused directly by Stalin, and got their version of Army Group South completely destroyed. That's, I think, 700,000 troops. If you have these still in your flank and you're going for Moscow, and that offensive runs out of steam, and then you have 700,000 troops on top of what is facing you right now, that is causing the winter counterattack, I don't think that would have been a good idea. And I'm going to read the quote from the historian here. Let me see, where was that? I might not actually have it here, but the Strail is basically of my opinion. He actually thinks that if they had not done this at Kiev, they would have basically run into a major problem. I'm actually going to find that quote real quick while I'm giving you some time to breathe again and just consider and maybe discuss what I just said. So this Kiev-Moscow thing is actually not as simple as just this was a choice to make and they could have done either one. That's not actually what happened here. Any opinions about that?
Well, I think you flattened everything. Yeah, I think we are once again, if you look at this as a discussion, I'm absolutely agree with what you're saying, but I'm saying something different, and we have to be careful not to discuss for hours and talking.
Yeah, I mean, it is still a historical discussion, but it seems like the historians are coming more and more to the conclusion that the Germans had actually lost this operation already after the Battle of Smolensk in July.
Yeah,
everything that happened after that was still a discussion, but it basically became irrelevant. And at the moment that they made it, neither of them would have gotten them any closer to a final victory, but Kiev at least took out a huge chunk of troops. So technically, it put them closer to a victory that they wouldn't be able to achieve anyway. So, yeah,
exactly. That's my point. It's if you're in a situation like that, trying to take out groups of armies doesn't help you. So the only thing that in theory has a slight chance of working is somehow forcing them to collapse. And I think the best chance for that is in Moscow. But I agree that it's not very likely and not very likely to work. But if you just force more army groups to surrender, that really doesn't do anything. So not in a situation you're in at that moment.
Yeah, and
yeah, true. Given all those situations, it would have been suicide to attack Moscow, and it totally makes sense to split up the forces. But even in the best case scenario, that doesn't win you the war.
Yeah, and that's the thing. If you look into the situation, there's basically not really anything that is obvious on how they could have won the war. They basically had to defeat the German army by the end of summer. And when that didn't work, they had made 2 breakthroughs and they still hadn't won. They basically ran out of ideas. And at that point, when you consider the losses that the Germans have taken at that point, how every one of their offensive powers have gone so low. And yes, they were able to pull off a couple more offensives, but again, that was mostly because the Soviets had exhausted themselves in front of them, but they were building additional stuffs behind. So, yeah, it is really, really, really hard to figure out what the Germans could have done here. There's actually something here that I'm reading also. Indeed, far from crumbling, the Red Army was in fact growing in size, fed by a huge pool of non-active reserves. Moreover, unlike the German army, the Red Army did not have to win the war in 1941. It only had to survive long enough for Germany's offensive strength to exhaust itself. And that's exactly the problem. The Germans had to win this by the end of the year. If not, they're lost. The Soviets, all they had to do was not get annihilated. That's the only thing they had to do. And they would have won. That's how they won. They just prevented themselves from being annihilated. That's all they had to do. That's why this was such an uneven battle. Basically, the Germans had to achieve so much more than the Russians had to achieve here. The Russians just had to make sure that they wouldn't get completely wiped out. And if you have 14 million people available, that is actually not that hard to do. So, I mean, the Germans achieved a major victory here. Like taking out about, 5 million people. Basically the entire size of the Red Army. I mean, they basically achieved their original goal. They wanted to take out the entire Red Army and then they thought they would crumble. They just did not expect that after they'd done that, there would be another Red Army ready and waiting. And Nobody expected this. Nobody knew about this amount of mobilization capability that the Soviets had. Nobody in the world knew that. It's not just the Germans. Everybody at this point, after the initial successes and these huge pocket battles and these huge losses that the Soviets took, everybody expected them to lose because nobody was aware of this. The Soviets alone knew that they had that capability, and also everybody expected the Soviet leadership to be way more crumbly. They expected them to basically fall apart like the Soviet leadership had, like the Russian leadership had fallen apart in 1917. But that didn't happen. The Soviet leadership was actually much stronger and had much more link to the population than they expected. And that link grew when they made the propaganda move of actually declaring this the great homeland war. This leadership just didn't fall apart. And that was a major part of the German plan, that would happen at some point, but it didn't. And if you take out 5 million troops and that doesn't happen, then what do? What options do you still have? Take out the next 5 million? And that's exactly what they did. And that's also something. Before I go into the couple of myths, and these are really the smaller scale myths that I wanted to mention, and we can maybe do your part before I go into that, Brock. But what I still wanted to mention is, because I know we have a lot of American viewers, just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of what this actually meant. Because a lot of Americans, and I know this is not due to Americans being stupid or anything like a lot of people always put out there because they're morons. It's a lot to do with the media. Because obviously Americans and British and all the Western nations, basically, I mean, it's the same in Germany. We hear way more, well, in Germany it depends, but even to some degree. What are the movies about? The movies are about like Market Garden and D-Day and North Africa and all that kind of stuff. And the Battle of the Bulge and that kind of stuff. So you actually think that is a major contribution to the war, and that actually made a major difference, right? That actually won the war. That is not even close to anywhere of a contribution. I'm going to read you some numbers here. The United States had a population of about 130 million in 1939. The total losses from military causes of the United States was 400,000 roughly. And that was on both theaters of the war, so not just in Europe. So I think their losses were roughly equal. So you can basically say they lost about 200,000 on the European theater, roughly. The total number of 400,000 is about 0.3% of the total population of the country at that time. 0.3%. Now compare that to some other numbers. The Soviet Union lost, the exact numbers are a little sketchy, but they lost anything from 9 to 12 million people. Just military deaths. 9 to 12 million soldiers in the war, compared to 400,000 of the Americans. If I look into that, that is in total over all the areas of the Soviet Union, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, all that kind of stuff. That is almost 14% of the population. Just military losses. Maybe total losses, I'm not sure. But maybe it's not clear from this graphic whether this is actually including the civilian deaths. But they lost basically 14% of their population. The Germans lost anything from 4.5 to 5.5 million. That is about 8.5% of the German population. And most of those, of the German losses, easily 99% of those losses. The losses on the Western Front were roughly equal to what the Americans lost, a couple 100,000. These 5 million losses that the Germans had were all on the Eastern Front. At no point of the war had the Germans anything less than 60% of the army stationed in the east. At no point in time. Even during the Battle of the Bulge. If you put that into consideration, what the American, don't let them get wrong, the American contribution was already, of course, important. It introduced strategic problems, but in terms of pure fighting power and inflicting losses, it was a joke. Was not even on the same ballpark, not even close. The major contribution that the Americans actually did was produce stuff. The trucks that they sent to the Soviet Union alone to enable them to actually keep the supply chain running that the Germans couldn't keep running because they didn't have those trucks. That alone made a huge difference. The actual fighting, that's almost completely irrelevant. Building stuff. Building stuff, building stuff, building stuff. That's what won the war contribution of the Americans. Bombing stuff, just forget about it. Yeah, there were bombing runs, and sometimes they reduced the German production. But if you look at the numbers, even at the worst time and the heaviest bombardment, the German production increased. It didn't decrease. Or probably it would have increased a little more, but it never actually managed to reduce the German war production. Never did. So the bombing campaign, nowadays, historians are very, very, questioning whether that bombing campaign actually ever achieved anything decisive. Not really. Also, the Americans and in general, the Allies, definitely the Americans though, never actually had any campaigns against the German Panzer production. They just didn't. They attacked the Air Force production. They attacked the Luftwaffe production. They had very specific plans to knock out the Focke-Wulf production and that kind of thing. They never had any clear targets to knock out the Panzer production. So that didn't get impacted as much as people think. So the American industrial capability, that was what was the main decisive factor. What the American army did, that important contribution was actually more in the Pacific theater. In Europe, Germany lost the war against the Soviet Union, not against the Western Allies. With contributions in material from the Western Allies, but not actually fighting against the Western Allies. It's a major thing that you need to realize. And I'm also gonna put something on here because the scale of this is sometimes also not really understood. Because looking at a European map for an American, and I realize this, if I look at a different continent, like how big is this actually? You don't really know if you don't have your own country right next to it. You don't really have an idea what are we actually talking about here. So I'm actually going to show you something here. Let me keep the borders. Okay, let me draw a polygon here. Let me quickly do that, like something like this. And let's say we're starting, from the Polish border, basically. I didn't want you. There we go. Something like this. Like start from the Polish border, roughly like that. Go for Leningrad. Go for... Well, let's go for the advance that they made in 1941. Let's go even further down here because we kind of include the part of the Crimea and we went in here from Romania. So roughly we have an area that looks roughly like this, right? Okay, let me zoom out a little. And let's move this thing. I think it should even tell us how much that actually is. Yeah, that's an area of 1.3 million square kilometers, basically. So let's rotate that a little bit. Let's rotate that around. So I have it around this roughly. And let's put that into the United States. That's what Germany took in how much? July, August, September, October, November, December. Yeah, that's what they took in 6 months. I think some Americans might now go, oh crap. They advanced all the way to Chicago, and in the south they almost reached Houston. That is basically, remember that East Coast scenario of the vanilla campaign? You're actually already pushing into the second scenario of the, what was that called? The middle, whatever?
Midwest, I think.
Midwest, yeah. You basically have already taken part of the Midwest scenario. Because you're already past the Mississippi. I think that's the big river that you have to cross initially in the Midwest campaign. In the Midwest scenario. You're already, in the south, you're already past that river. You already have to have Houston, the first goal in that area, or Dallas, or whatever that was. So, yes, this is what they took, and this is what they had to held and control. There's bypassed Soviet troops all over the place here. Miserable country, invading the United States, aside from getting past the Atlantic. But if you take that away, invading the United States would have been a lot easier, because Midwest is ideal tank country. The stuff that they were in Russia, not really. Here you have actual roads, and even where you don't have roads, you have basically flat ground, ideal stuff to advance. Even the weather is much nicer. Imagine taking half the United States without the infrastructure, with miserable terrain, miserable weather, and you actually achieve that. Yeah, you have mountains and rivers everywhere, but the major mountains are actually further in the west. This terrain is actually still pretty good. And rivers were also everywhere in the Soviet Union, trust me, together with dense forest and marshes and very much undeveloped country. Imagine the Germans are able to take this, and you still don't win. You're not even close to winning. Despite taking this amount of area, taking out 5 million troops, and you're still not one step closer to actually winning. And now imagine how the people felt like in 1941 winter. How is this ever actually going to end? Another thing that I'm going to say about the Kiev-Moscow decision is actually there are reports about the morale situation when the order came that we're actually not going to go for Moscow, we're going to go for Kiev, that a lot of people, because yeah, the initial orders had been that Moscow was not the main goal anyway, but the normal soldier on the ground, yeah, I mean, first we marched towards Warsaw, then we marched towards Paris, and then of course we're going to march toward Moscow, right? Where else are we going to go? I mean, that's probably the only city that any German knows at this point in Russia anyway. So when the order comes, we're actually not going to go to Moscow, that's when people suddenly realize, oh crap, there might actually be a problem here. Because at this point, people have kept going and going and going with no end in sight in this vast countryside where you get stuck and you see nothing but countryside, all empty, all wide open spaces. It's incredible. But at least you're getting somewhere closer to Moscow, right? You think, okay, just one more push and then this is finally over and we can go home. Okay, that's completely unrealistic because, as I said, even taking Moscow would probably not have ended it, but that's, if you're a normal soldier, that's kind of the only beacon of hope you have, right? You're completely at the end of your strength. You say, okay, let's just take that one stupid town so we can go home. And if then the order comes, we're actually not going to take that, from the morale perspective, that was a major issue. Later they actually went for Moscow, but at that point in time, that was a major issue. Never mind that wouldn't have worked anyway, and that the order actually made sense, but the normal soldier on the ground doesn't know the big picture. He just knows, we're gonna go forward here, we're gonna take Moscow, and then this is over. Just like we took Paris and the war is over. We took Warsaw and the war is over. We just want to go home. We marched 500 kilometers on foot. We're completely exhausted. We're done. We're completely gone. We don't have anything to shoot with anymore. All our equipment is broken. Let's just do this final attack. And then we can finally go home again and see our girlfriends. Nope. After this, that becomes a major problem on the Eastern Front, the morale situation, because at that point nobody knows anymore when this is actually going to end. And when we talk about the situation of 1942, that's basically also where you can see in what situation the Germans are. When Ubrak said that they had to cannibalize certain panzer divisions to get some others back into working order, you can see in 1941 they attacked basically along 3 major axes. In 1942 they only attacked along 1 axis. Only Army Group South was now attacking anymore. Army Group North and Center did not have the strength to attack anymore. In 1943, they attacked Kursk, a tiny sector of the front. So you can clearly see that the German army is running out of offensive capability. 1941 completely blunted the German army. After that, Blitzkrieg is done. They somehow managed to pull off another surprise in 1942. But basically, there's no way anymore after the winter of 1941, even after the summer of 1941, that they can attack on 3 vectors anymore. There's just no stuff left. They just can't pull it off anymore. They completely exhausted everything they had, and they're done. 1942 is a desperate attempt to get something done, but after that doesn't work, which was very unlikely to work anyway, it's just over. Technically, it was over in August 1941. So then I think we can switch to your stuff, Bruck.
Yeah, if there are not any more questions.
But that is because Germany went full wartime production at the same time as Americans went full bombing. Yeah, of course, that was also a major issue in 1941, that Germany actually did not go into a war mobilized economy until 1942. They, of course, should have done that already in 1941. Not only should they have increased the production right away, they should also have, of course, cleared the delivery of every war material that they could produce immediately to the front and not hold that back for future operations. I'm not even sure what those future operations are supposed to be. But yeah, that's just crazy. But yeah, that was, of course, a major issue. But if you expect this to be over by 6 weeks because you expect the Soviet Union to be such an unstable state, and such an unstable state that they're just going to fall apart as soon as you cross the border, yeah. That didn't happen, but that's what they expected. Everybody expected that, not just Hitler. The German army was right behind this. And you really have to remember, you cannot exempt any German general from his responsibility for this. They all screwed it up in planning, they all screwed it up in execution, and they all screwed it up in the war crimes. Every German general on the Eastern Front, almost everyone was involved in this. Everyone passed the orders. Everybody had war crimes in this area and knew about it, and everybody knew what the SS was doing behind them. It's all a bunch of garbage. Rommel can be exempt because he was never on the Eastern Front, and I don't know whether he would have been against it. I actually expect that he would have a major problem with it. He also had a major problem with what was happening in France with the Jews. But anybody that actually was on the Eastern Front knew about it, was responsible for it, and they're all to blame. There are no good guys on the Eastern Front, except for very small exceptions. And it is a very telling tale that the resistance, when it came up, even though those guys were not all clean, didn't have a clean slate either, and they're not all whitewashed Democrats or something like that. There are a lot of assholes in there, but even the ones that did try to do something were actually the colonels, not the generals. It was the colonels that tried to do something. The generals went along with it to the bitter end. So any hero worshipping of some of these guys like Guderian and Manstein and stuff, think twice about it. Rommel maybe, although again he was also not exactly the greatest strategic mind, and he also disobeyed orders left, right, and center. But and he lost the North African campaign in the end. He at least seemed to have been a half decent guy, even though he was incredibly naive. Because later in the war, he actually expected to be able to make a separate peace with Montgomery, purely on the basis that he and Montgomery had been on opposite sides in the war on North Africa, and he expected that to have formed some kind of almost brothers in arms connection. And yeah, Montgomery didn't really see it that way. But yeah, he had a kind of naive, almost romantic picture of war, which didn't really hold up. But at least he seemed to have been a more decent guy than anybody else, which might have been due to the fact that he was not actually a Prussian. He actually grew up in southern Germany, so he was not part of that tradition. But yeah, anybody that actually was of that tradition and fought on the Eastern Front, basically, without exception, was a major asshole. So careful with any hero worship here. So, okay, what should I open for your stuff?
Well, one moment. I think I forgot how I named them, but I think they are named like green unsuppressed, unsub is the first one.
Green unsuppressed, unsub. That should be that one, right?
Yeah, I will see it with a delay. But what I want to go over is I did a series of experiments to find out what actually determines how much experience your units get during fighting. And especially seeing a lot of people lately using tons of artillery. And I won't name anyone. And some people, including sometimes me, even refuse to attack on loss predictions that are 0 losses because the enemy unit is not totally suppressed. And you could have a bad roll and still take damage. So some people are also avoiding those attacks. And I was wondering, is this really the best thing to do? And it probably is, but there's definitely a downside to it. So I did a series of experiments and tried different experience levels and different suppression levels. So you see here an attack with infantry using mass attack bonus. And I know, Richard Martin, I was not thinking about you. You're doing the same thing, but I was thinking about another game. And I'm doing it sometimes myself. So it's no criticism. It's just finding out what's actually better. So if you use mass attack bonus, do the attack here and actually get the correct prediction. So if your roll is 2-4, your unit will get 84 points of experience. So it was a green unit doing the attack. And you see it in the 4th line in the detailed unit description. So
48, you mean? No, not 84.
48.
Yeah,
48. So it's 48, and this is the shot taken from after the attack happened. So then the next one is green suppressed.
Let me actually move them over all first, then I can easier switch. So green suppressed, that's that one.
Yeah, and here we have the same attack. Green infantry going for a totally... Nope, that's now...
Yeah, I moved them all over. I'm
okay.
switching back. I'm switching back.
So that's the same attack now on a totally suppressed unit. And you're getting 20 points of experience for that. So that's not even half of it. And in the process, you avoided 2 damage, used 4 units for 1 attack. And like I said, got half of the experience out of it. And if you replace that loss by regular replacements, you still get more experience out of it without having to pay anything. But there are downsides to this, of course, because if you are doing attacks on unsuppressed units, you can have very bad rolls, and this can backfire a lot, and you can take 4 or 5 or even 6 damage out of an attack like this if you have a very bad roll. And of course, you have to keep in mind that you need to keep your units going till the end of the campaign. So you have to be very careful, and suppression definitely is something you should use a lot, but just a reminder that it doesn't have all upsides. So the experience you get is not determined by the amount of damage you do. In both cases, we did 4 points of damage. I think it's more about the risk that is involved. So if you do a risky attack, you usually get more experience than if you are doing a completely safe attack. So especially completely safe attack will get you almost no experience. So the next one.
So taking risks is awarded.
Yeah.
So
the next one is high roll.
High roll. It's a Gebirgsjäger, right?
Yeah, genau. Sure. So here we're doing a very risky attack and getting a very good result. So the combat prediction is 2-5, and we actually got the 6-0 out of it, and we got the whooping 72 points of experience out of it. So if you high roll, you are even rewarded for that. And I think that's a little bit of a silly system, because getting lucky is additionally, you get an additional bonus in the game for getting lucky, and I think it shouldn't be that way. And on the other hand, if you get an unlucky roll, you get far less experience. I didn't make a screenshot for that, but if you control the battle by using lots of artillery, you get a very controlled result. And if you don't do it and you get very lucky or unlucky rolls, you can have better and extremely good results and really skyrocket the experience of your units. On the other hand, you can take a lot of damage. So it's a risky business, and you shouldn't overdo it.
Okay, then elite unsuppressed.
Yeah.
Okay, go.
And game on, the casualties I inflicted were exactly the same. So that's the point. It doesn't matter how much casualties you inflict. So it's purely based on how much opposition you're overcoming. I think that puts it right. So if you are only fighting against unsuppressed ranks, you will get almost 0 experience. And if you have a lot of unsuppressed ranks to fight, you will get lots of experience. So
efficient. Just a quick interruption here. Efficient strategy gaming. Can you explain the difference between Rommel and Field Marshal game difficulties? Well, in Rommel you get half the prestige, in Field Marshal you get half the experience.
Yeah, so Rommel is not strictly more difficult than Field Marshal. It's only different.
And Field Marshal, that's why I did in my hard game play, I actually played Field Marshal, because Field Marshal is technically not one of the normal difficulty levels. It is already a special difficulty level like the other 3, because you already get 50% of something, in this case experience, and that's can be a problem. It's still easier than the other ones because it's not that big an issue, but having only half the experience is still not exactly nice. So because you can do less overstrength because you get the experience later.
Yeah, that's true. And you'll take more losses, and but usually still I think Field Marshal is the the easiest of all the
Yeah.
special
Yeah.
difficulty levels.
But you will definitely see that if you play through the vanilla campaign, you will have much less overstrength units as you have in any of the other difficulty levels.
Yeah, if you do a lot of overstrengths, that is. So, yeah, and since Richard Martin, you were saying you're doing a lot of suppression in the beginning to keep your units going, and that's one thing I expected as an argument. So I also tested more experienced units, and you see exactly the same setup again. Prediction is 2-4, and this time we are going in with a unit that has exactly 100 experience points, so it's at 1 star. And getting the predicted result again, we now result in 122 experience. So we got 22 experience out of this attack. So it's only half of the experience from the green unit. Exactly same attack. So the experience you get is decreasing with the experience of the units. So especially green units, I think, should take a lot of risks to get them over the 1-star or 2-star mark quickly, and it's very cheap to replace them because you are not losing so much when you do the normal replacements. If you do the math and you are at 200 or 300 experience, taking 2 points of damage already hurts a lot in terms of experience. But if your unit has only 100 experience and you lose 2 strength points, that's absolutely not a big deal, and you can normally replace that. And you'll still end up getting more experience without having to pay than going in against fully suppressed units. That's the point. So next one is
Elite suppressed.
Elite suppressed.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not a lot.
Yeah, exactly the same attack again. And what we get out of this is 10 points of experience. And this time since it's a 1-star unit, doing 5 points of damage. So you can't do less than that. But you see it's rapidly decreasing, and even if you completely wipe this unit out with a super lucky roll, you almost get no experience out of this. So I don't think it's bad to suppress units. I think it's a very good strategy, but I think you should choose wisely if you should not take... Well, I think it's advisable to consider taking risks sometimes because it can be beneficial. It can be much better to do a risky attack, get 2 points of damage, do normal replacements afterwards, and all things considered, you end up being off much better.
And that, by the way, Richard Martin just said 10 XP for no damage taken is better than 22 experience for 2 damage taken. I'm actually not sure that's the case. If you then do regular replacements, to what do you get reduced? Let me actually do that calculation. So well, you would end up at 122, right? You would in the 122, and if you do 2 damage replacement at regular, you would end up at 80% of that, right?
Sure.
So okay, then you end up below 1 star. So yeah, it depends on at what level you get the 10 XP. If you're green and you add 22 XP, that's the difference. If you added those 22 and you're at 122 XP, so that statement probably holds the further you go up in experience in total. If for a green unit, it might actually be better to take the 22 and the 2 damage. For an already experienced unit, you're probably right. It probably isn't worth it anymore. So
yeah, but you have to consider a lot of things. Yeah, and sure, if you do only this math, that's why I used this as an example for an elite unit, because the percentage, the prestige or the experience damage taken of course, the higher the XP is, the higher the damage is. It's very difficult for me to explain this in English. It sounds.
The more experienced you are, the more damaging damage is, basically.
Yeah. I hope you can follow. But it's not only that. In the process, you had to use 3 artillery units and the infantry to do the damage. In the other setting, you only had to use the infantry to do the damage. So the suppression thing will slow you down a lot.
Yeah, and that is the thing. If you're actually a quick interrupt here, Game On just posted the data from the game file. The experience growth rate from 0 to 100 is 1. From 100 to 200 is 50%, and then it's 25%, 12%, and then 6%. Yep. So yeah, it gets increasingly harder, which is actually realistic in some sense. I mean, to get a basically the bloke from next door to be a basic training capable soldier, I mean, that takes about 6 weeks. To get that guy into a veteran state, that takes a little bit longer. And to get someone to basically a crack elite guy, yeah, that takes a couple of years. So I mean, that is realistic. You can't compare getting someone from 0 to basic military knowledge to getting someone from there to elite unit. That takes, of course, longer, and it should take longer. You shouldn't just easily march all the way through to 5 stars, so the game is realistic in that sense. But going back what we said, yes, we use more units to achieve this. If you lose mass attack and you don't do that in a way that is very efficient, you lose time, you lose unit, you lose firepower, you're slower, and playing it safe makes you slower. And if because of that you take less flags, you get less prestige, that if you had taken more risks, you would have gotten that prestige, and then you could have done the elite replacements that you now can't do because you don't have the prestige. So at the end of the day, where would you actually have ended up with a better core plus better prestige in total in as a whole? That really depends on everything you do. You really have to figure out, is this worth the risk at this point in time? Because then I'm going to be able to achieve that one goal that might be worth achieving, and that might be worth the cost. You can't, of course, just give a total answer about this, just looking at one battle, at one fight, one unit against another unit. You have to keep the big picture in mind, but in this case, if you just look at the one battle, it's probably not worth taking the risk anymore for anything that has more than 0 stars, yes, but in the big picture it still might make sense.
Yeah, and I just wanted to put that out. And efficient strategy gaming, I think there's no optimal point for your units to be at. Ideally, I think you should have units with different experience levels. To have the right tool for the right task, because sometimes you have to do a risky attack and you don't want to risk your super elite unit for that, especially if it has overstrengths. And that's especially true for fighters, for example, because very often you will take 1 point of damage and you don't want to lose the very expensive overstrengths. And I just want to put that out you should be aware and not auto-suppress everything. I think many people fall into that, not talking about you again, Richard Martin, fall into that mode of auto-suppressing everything. And I've watched a lot of other players on YouTube lately, and they're doing so much suppression. I personally don't like that style because it's a little bit
gaming the system.
There's not so much action going on. It's more fun if there are actual fights with losses taken.
I've also watched these videos, and I also have to I think we also have to mention that most of these people are not playing blind. They also play with very unrealistic cores. They're basically very optimized, and they know what they need to do, and they know exactly what kind of core composition they need to be able to pull this off. If you want to play at very high difficulty levels blind, not knowing what you're going to run into, playing like that can be difficult. and it's not always going to work out. So it is definitely something that you can pull off.
Be flexible. You need to be flexible,
Yeah.
and going for an all suppression strategy is very unflexible in the end. But I just wanted to put that out for people that are watching. Don't feel inclined to. You don't have to play that way. It's totally fine if you want to do more risky attacks. There's a reward for that also. It has beneficials, and just think about what's better in the given situation, and sometimes it's best to totally suppress everything. Lieutenant Joker and me do this a lot of the time also. So it's not like I want to play without artillery. It's just don't feel inclined to super suppress everything and making a mistake if you take a damage point. I feel many people, or in many YouTube, I also complain in my own videos sometimes, damage taken, like that's the end of the world. It's really not. It's fine. It's okay to take damage, and I think it's more fun to play if you take damage occasionally.
Yeah, I have to say, it's also a matter of, I mean, there's no right or wrong way to play the game. Let's put that out there. As long as you actually manage to win the scenario, you've done something right. And if you, I think...
the most important thing, you have fun playing it. And if you have fun playing suppressing everything and figuring out how to do the scenario without taking a single point of damage, that's great.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's more a matter of actually challenging yourself to achieve something like getting an achievement or something. You beat this scenario without taking a point of damage. That's of course great. That there's always going to be, I'm going to challenge myself of playing this scenario like people do Africa Corps with just the Italian units. I mean, sure, why not? That's cool challenge to put yourself under. It's just not something that I would recommend necessarily to green players, because if you constantly try to suppress everything and not take a single point of damage and focus so much on artillery and suppression, you lose an overview of the other mechanics in the game, like mass attack bonus and other stuff that you can use to increase your initiative and avoid losses and that kind of thing. If you put all your cards into one basket, all your eggs into one basket, you kind of may miss out on learning the other mechanics. If you already learned them all and you know the game inside out, and then you would want to challenge yourself for a specific achievement, kind of, sure, whatever, go ahead. I mean, one of the main guys that does pull this off anyway is a person that obviously has played the game for a long time and knows about most of the mechanics. Not all of them. He, for example, doesn't seem to understand the retreat mechanics, and I think the two of us also took some time to figure that out, how that actually works, that they always retreat clockwise. But aside from those minor things, that person obviously I'm sorry, I would name his name, but I can't remember the channel name. But it's mostly experienced players that do this. I agree with Rack that saying that not so experienced players probably shouldn't focus too much on this stuff, because then you miss out on learning what other options you have, and you're always going to run into an issue, especially if you're playing blind, where at the right moment you don't have the artillery where you need it to be, and then you should still be able to do something. And if you know all the rules, you're still going to be able to pull it off. And just look at
you should be versatile in order to be a perfect armchair general. You should be versatile and not rely on a single strategy too much.
Exactly. And look at me and Brock. We still pull scenarios off where we do mistakes, where something goes wrong, where we don't play ideally, because we're playing blind. Me half blind half the time. I don't remember this scenario because last time I played it several years ago. So we're basically both playing mostly blind, and we run into problems all over the place. In the Streets of Moscow thing, I got huge amount of units damage. So I actually did some replacements, some elite replacements, some regular replacements, even dropping huge amounts of XP. But we do what we need to do to win the scenario, and usually we pull it off. And if we pull it off and we can continue to do the campaign, And it's fine no matter how you did it. As long as you keep up a core that can win the next scenario still, it's fine whatever you did. I mean, obviously what Brock did there with keeping his units not completely thing, that wasn't exactly great, but he still pulled off a victory, and he...
Yeah, it was fun to play, but most people didn't seem to like it. But
I liked it. I
had a lot of fun
I liked it. I liked watching it. I wouldn't have liked doing it. So yeah, it was great. And I mean, you won, and your units were still capable of winning the next scenario. Obviously not doing the same thing again, but it also didn't prevent you from being able to continue, so it was fine. I mean, if you want to challenge yourself to these things, and that only shows you, even if you do completely crazy stuff like that, you can still pull it off, and if you then can keep going, then it was fine, whatever you did. So yeah, sure, you took a lot of damage. I also lost a unit. I got several of my Panzers killed. I, by the way, now know why that happened. That is one tip I can give people. If you actually, you remember, I had, what's this game? What's the one Panzer hero called? Karsha? Yeah, Karsha.
Yeah.
I put Karsha with 12 strength in front of something and expected him to be never attacked, and then suddenly he was attacked by KV. I'm actually very convinced that KV would not have attacked if I hadn't made a crucial mistake. I put my tank directly next to a T-34. That gave the attacking KV automatically a mass attack bonus. If that hadn't been the case, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have attacked. Never do that. Never put a unit that you expect not the AI not to attack next to an enemy unit. You automatically give every attacking unit mass attack against you. That was a stupid mistake on my part. I should never have done that. I should put that guy one hex further over, and I'm pretty sure he would have been fine.
But at least he lived.
Yeah, sure, he lived, but it put me...
I killed off Wirnsberger, and I don't have reform units, so he's gone for good.
Yeah, that happens, but I mean, it's definitely not nice. But those are the kind of mistakes that you make, and then you realize, oh my god, I actually made a major stupid action here. Never put a unit next to a unit. It automatically gives the enemy a mass attack bonus. And why the hell would you give them that advantage? It's these kinds of issues that we still do wrong, and we still lose units, but we still pull it off. It's just gonna work. Of course, you can challenge yourself. I'm never gonna lose a unit. I'm never gonna use even one damage point. But that's not what you need to do.
Yeah, and of course, and don't fall in this trap that, yeah, taking damage is bad and bad rule, and oh, I have to reload now because I can't continue. So that really takes the fun out of the game, I think. So that was the main point of that. And I think game on, you're right. Keeping a unit above 2 stars without elite replacements most of the time should definitely be possible if you do some well thought out risky attacks, especially using mass attack bonus helps a lot. And yeah, mass attack is a form of suppression. It's not as reliable, but it works as well.
Yeah, and efficient strategy gaming, are we playing with weather effects on? Yes, we do. We play with everything on. So supply, weather effects, all that stuff.
Yeah, and I am very much thinking about changing my playstyle a bit to rely less on suppression. I started at Arras on Manstein to really go into direct fights more, and it paid off. I was super quick on that one. I could have even beaten the map on Guderian time frame, I think. So yeah, it definitely has benefits. And
yeah, sure. I mean,
it's not like I played without artillery. It's not about using artillery or not using artillery. It's about finding the right balance. That's what motivates me.
Yeah, and people constantly comment that I play way more aggressively and take way more risk than you. I mean, yes, but I still pull it off. It's a different play style. Do you take more risk? Do you play more aggressively? Do you take a little bit more safe? different ways of doing it, and I mean, even in real war, you have different generals with different styles. Some are gonna take some more risks, some are not. As long as you get the job done, everything's good. Of course, yeah, if you get your entire army wiped out doing it, that might be not so great, but that's like Guderian. Like I said, in Poland, he took way more losses than everybody else. It's not actually happening in Barbarossa again. He took about 50% more losses than Hoth. So his Panzer group took most of the losses of all the Panzer groups. So Guderian is not the kind of guy you want to be serving under if you want to have a high survival rate. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, good thing in our case it's only a digital army.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter at all. And yeah, I think that's interesting. So I want to experiment more with doing more normal replacements and doing more risky attacks to still grow the experience in total.
Yeah, in bad weather, full suppression is probably advisable. But again, you can also make what Brokada and I are doing sometimes, of not attacking in rain at all and let the enemy attack. Because he will then attack into non-suppressed units and he will take the major faults. You just need to make sure you are actually protected by artillery that way. So you can do it like that. Depends, of course, on how much time you have, but that's another strategy of just waiting it out.
Sometimes works, but it has done me a lot of damage also, because then suddenly the AI takes risky attacks it normally wouldn't, because the odds are better and the artillery is not visible, and suddenly your 88 is almost dying.
Yeah, you have to work with those chances a little bit. Yeah, but again, you can have different solutions to these problems. You don't necessarily have to solve that with suppression. Yep.
And I also, at the moment, I'm experimenting to use. I was one of the biggest advocates of using level bombers, but at the moment I'm trying to switch them out for strategic, for tactical bombers more, because if you use them to prepare an attack for the next turn, they kind of work like super artillery, because the AI will buy replacements, damage its prestige, and you starts the turn with a suppressed unit. So that's pretty nice, and usually works better than a level bomber.
Yeah, I try to keep a good mix. I know there's people that play mostly with level bombers or mostly with Stugas. I try to keep a good mix of everything. So what I'm trying to do is copy a little bit the play style of that other YouTuber that has certain hero units that are overstrength and uses them basically as blockers and as units that can take points alone, because he knows the AI is probably not going to attack them. I'm trying to do that in Streets of Moscow. Again, I think that failed because I did some wrong moves with those units, but until that point it worked actually great. So I'm trying to keep that going, that strategy, and figure out whether that actually helps me. Have key units overstrength. It also puts a little bit more. I mean, the AI overstrength is all its named units, so why shouldn't I, right? So that's kind of a playstyle that I'm going to experiment with a little bit in 1942. But I think that's that about this topic. Before we go into the core setup of 1942, I'm going to go back to the actual history stuff and go into some more military myths. Not a whole lot, but a couple. First one is not so much a myth, it's just a matter of opinion. Was the T-34 actually a decent tank? Did it win the war for the Soviets? Absolutely, but why did it do that? I found a website that I might actually link in here. This is a guy that apparently wants to figure out certain numbers and rules to build a World War II Barbarossa simulation at some point. And he figures out all the data, what was actually the relative effectiveness of units against each other and all that kind of stuff. And he has some nice data that usually you say, oh yeah, the T-34 had so many losses because those were operational losses, which basically means most of the tanks that get damaged can be repaired. But if the enemy forces push the front line forward so you can't get to the tanks, even though it was repairable, it is a total loss because you can't get to it. That's an operational loss. It's technically not a low total loss, but it becomes one because you can't get to the tank. So they said, okay, the initial total losses of T-34s were so high because there were a lot of operational losses. They couldn't get to them because the Germans were pushing forward so quickly. But then he looked at the data of what was that actually like when the Soviets were in the attack, and it doesn't actually change a whole lot. The kill-to-loss ratio of the T-34 was still absolutely awful. So, yes, it was an absolute crap tank on the tactical level. The good thing about it was they could build loads of them in a short amount of time. That was how they won the war with it. It was absolutely not a good tank. If you look at the Chieftain, he tries to get in and out of it. It's an absolute nightmare. You can't see anything from it and all that kind of stuff. It's a crap tank. It's not a good tank, not even close. That it was an export success later, just like the Sherman, in my opinion, that doesn't say anything about the tanks. That just says about anything about who won the war. If you win the war, you're going to be the one exporting crap after that. The Sherman at least was a good tank. The T-34 not so much, but the Soviet Union just exported it because all the countries under their influence couldn't buy it from anywhere else. So of course they took the T-34, but it's not a good tank. Maybe the later ones were a little better. The initial, especially the initial one, was absolute garbage. But if you can build it very quickly, of course it's gonna win the war. If you can build them faster than the Germans can destroy them, well, that's gonna win you the war, whether it's good or not, right? So, putting that out there, it did not have a good war performance. It actually got destroyed way more than it actually killed German tanks. It was absolutely not a good tank. And the Germans were more than capable of destroying them in large numbers. The fact is simply that the Soviets could build them faster still than the Germans could destroy them. So that's the first thing. That was not a war winner. It's just not a good tank. It was a good tank for the Soviets to have and to be able to build it quickly. But in a one-to-one comparison, it's probably one of the worst tanks of the war. There's also, and I think this is actually in some of the briefings, correct me if I'm wrong, Brock, where they mention these Soviet Siberian divisions coming in to go for the counterattack in front of Moscow, right? I know it was in Panzer General. I think Panzer Corps repeated that in some briefing, didn't they?
Yeah, it's in the streets of Moscow. Those guards units in the back, they are all those Siberian divisions.
Yeah, okay. Those never existed. This is also one guy from this website. I actually looked into it, and he looked into all the units that were actually transferred from the Siberian and even the Eastern Front from Japan, because those Siberian units, there's also this myth about once there was one guy that was a spy in Japan, and once he found out that the Japanese were actually not going to attack the Soviet Union, that's when those Siberian divisions were transferred west and stuff like that. You
read that all the time.
Yeah, it didn't happen. Not even close. There was never any major movement of troops from the Eastern Front to the West. There's no such thing. The only units that got actually transferred back there had their transfer orders written already before the Germans even invaded. They got transferred west. Those were rifle division here, rifle division there. None of those actually fought in front of Moscow at any point. There was one division that was, I think, that was a guards division that got a name that was called the Siberian Division, that fought around Moscow, but most of the troops in that division weren't even from Siberia. So, that was just a name only, and that was just one division. So those Soviet divisions just never existed. Around that time when this happened, there were no transfers from that area to Moscow. Just none. I think where this came up is simply that the Germans stuck in front of Moscow, and as I said, this huge mobilization effort just put a huge amount of new divisions in front of them, and those counterattacked, and the Germans had just no idea where are those divisions coming from. So they thought that there had to be reinforcements coming in from Siberia, right? Because the Japanese didn't attack and blah, blah, blah. I think this is a myth that developed in the German army because they just couldn't figure out how the Soviets keep coming up with all these divisions. But in reality, there were simply divisions that were produced as part of this mobilization effort. They came out of the Moscow area. They were mobilized right there. They had been part of the general mobilization effort, and they had nothing to do with Siberia whatsoever. These famed elite Siberian divisions never existed. It's a complete urban myth. Absolutely no basis in reality.
Well, who would have thought that?
Yeah. I mean, there were new divisions coming out of nowhere. But again, that had nothing to do with Siberia. That was just a normal mobilization effort. And as I said, yeah, if you go from 5 million to 8 million, despite you having lost 5 million, then of course, yeah, your enemy is gonna make up some explanation of where those troops are coming from, because you can't just imagine that they're normal mobilized units. Like, how does that happen? No way. They had to come from Siberia, right? Yeah, that is a myth, but it's probably what the German generals wrote, and then everybody copied it. But yeah, that's what they expected or believed, but it has no basis in reality. Obviously, until now, we didn't have access to the sources of the Soviet Union because those archive has only been opened recently. So yeah, until anybody looked in there and actually looked at the transfer orders, you had no way of debunking that myth, obviously. But now we do, and there's no basis to it. The other thing is the 88 was such an effective thing. It was a marvel of German engineering. That is basically not true. Everybody else had similar guns with similar capabilities. The problem is they just never used them in this way. The Germans relatively early managed to realize that not only was this kind of gun, very capable of being used against ground targets, not so much tanks back then, more bunkers and stuff like that. So they used them that way. And not only did they use them that way, they also made a special mounting for it that could actually be depressed to even negative degrees, so you can shoot down hills with that thing. Very unusual for an anti-aircraft gun. And they gave them ground attack sights, so you could replace the air attack sights with ground attack sights that allow you to better aim at ground targets. And they also managed to realize that if you actually want to engage moving targets like tanks with a gun, what kind of troops do you need for that? Those need to be troops that are highly trained, are capable of quick reaction, quick relocation of their stuff, and tracking moving targets. Well, that kind of sounds like the job description of an anti-aircraft guy, right? So obviously these guys had the skills, so why not use them against tanks? They already know how to track very quickly moving targets at long distances, so cool. Everybody had those guns. Everybody, the Soviets, the Western Allies, basically everybody had them. Similar capability, very similar penetration power. Just nobody else ever had this idea, apparently, and nobody gave them ground targets. Most of the other mountings never allowed these guns to be depressed that low. And also the Germans developed anti-tank projectiles, anti-tank ammunition for these guns. Everybody else only had the normal high explosive stuff that you shoot at airplanes. The Germans actually gave these specifically anti-tank ammunition. So they had the ammunition, they had the sights, and they had the mounting. The gun itself is pretty much equivalent to anything else. So in pure engineering point of view, they're no better than anything the other guys had. They just used them effectively in that role because they realized they were going to be great for that. Anybody else could have done it. They just didn't do it for whatever reason. So I'm not even sure how realistic it is that the Soviet guns can be switched, because from all sources that I've read so far, nobody else did it. And I'm not even sure that the Soviet guns can be depressed that low. Maybe they did it in some cases. I've never seen any source for it, but they might be out there. Maybe sometimes they did it, so I'm not going to say it's impossible. But on a large scale, nobody but the Germans ever did it. But it's not the actual engineering of the gun that makes the difference. It's how you use it that makes the difference. And then we have the door knocker, Anklopfgerät. There is a myth, well, it's not exactly a myth that actually happened. The 3.7 centimeter anti-tank gun that the Germans still had most across their divisions as their regular anti-tank gun. They had a couple of 5 centimeter, of course, by this time, but most of it was still the 3.7 standard anti-tank gun. There's a myth out there that was completely inadequate at this time, that it was a complete idiocy to use that as the standard anti-tank gun going into Russia, and that the German troops henceforth called it the Anklopfgerät, basically the door knocker, because that's all they did. They basically knocked on the tank but couldn't penetrate it. Well, first of all, the naming didn't happen in Russia. That already happened in France, because they did basically the same thing against the heavier French tanks. So obviously the German troops were a little bit frustrated with them. But were they really completely useless, and was it a major mistake to have that still as the standard anti-tank gun in Russia? Well, not exactly. So if you look at the actual data, what did the Soviets actually have in Russia? They had about 24,000 tanks in service. At the front, they were not all at the front, some were in rear areas, blah, 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 blah. But basically, they had about 10,000 T-26s, about 3,000 T-37s and T-38s and T-40s, 50, and all that kind of stuff, those light tanks. They had 59 T-35s, 442 T-28s, 7.5 thousand BTs, and around 950 T-34s and 530 KV-1s. You can immediately see that the vast majority of tanks that the Germans are facing are not T-34s and KVs. Those together make like 1,500 tanks out of 25,000, out of 24,000. So how much can the Pak-36 actually do against these guys? So it can penetrate the following tanks frontally. The T-26 models, T-38, T-60, BT-5. It can engage those and penetrate them frontally at 1.5 kilometers. Between 500 and 1,000 meters, it can engage the PT-7s and the T-35s and T-28s. It can engage at ranges under 100 meters and still penetrate them frontally. T-26s at different levels from the sides, it can engage them at even longer ranges, and blah, 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 blah. So basically, the Pak-36 could destroy over 91% of all existing Soviet tank forces. And it did that. They destroyed 20,000 Soviet tanks in 1941. And the large majority of those were not destroyed by German tanks, but by the Pak-36. So if you have a standard anti-tank gun that destroys 91% of this tank force that the Soviets have in 1941, that can't have been all that bad. So considering what they were facing, it was still perfectly adequate. Remember, not everything they're running into is a T-34. If they run into those, yes, that's going to be a problem. But that's not going to be everything they're going to run into. 91% of what they ran into was something they could kill, and they destroyed 20,000 tanks, the vast majority of which with that pack gun. So it was still more than capable of doing a whole lot of damage. So that is not correct, that thing was completely inadequate. That is just not true. It destroyed almost 20,000 tanks. Then, let me check this again. There were some other ones. Oh yeah, there's that one myth that gets repeated all over the place. Unfortunately, even in books of authors that should know better, including Glantz, he actually contradicts himself in this area, strangely enough. And I think it's just one sentence that historians keep repeating, even though they're actually not checking it, because everybody's been writing it. In 1940, or let's start it all the way until in Falweiss in Poland, they had basically 5, 6 kind of panzer divisions and a couple of light divisions. In France, they had 10 panzer divisions, and in Russia, they had yeah, let's say roughly 20. They had a little bit more, but some of those didn't make it in the initial setup. So let's say they had around 20 panzer divisions. So there's this myth going around that in order to create this doubling of the panzer divisions, Hitler just split the panzer divisions in two, took half the tanks out of every panzer divisions, and use those to create the other 10. So basically, on paper, you had 20 panzer divisions, but each of them was only half the strength of the original one. Everybody tell me in chat, and Brock, also you maybe, that has heard this claim.
Yeah, I've heard it, of course.
That's complete bullshit. And we've talked about this actually when I showed you what a panzer division looks like. It's completely not true. For the following reasons. First of all, we said, okay, initially we have 4 panzer battalions, that means 4 units for us, and in 1941 you suddenly only have 2 or 3. So it seems like you halved it, right? Yeah, but just because you have only the half amount of battalions, that doesn't mean those battalions still look the way they looked before. First of all, in a battalion, you have certain companies, and certain companies look different. Now a battalion that before had 3 companies now suddenly can have 4 companies. A lot of them had that. Also, the types of tanks changed. Where before you had like 60 to 80% Panzer Is and Panzer IIs, now you suddenly have well over 50% Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. So you now have actually the good stuff. The amount of tanks also not even remotely changed to half. There were around, I don't know, anything between 60 to 80% the amount of tanks. It also depends on actually, are you using the Czech tanks, then you have a little more. Are you using Panzer IIIs, then you have a little less. But there you can already see they use less tanks because they know those tanks are better. So usually when you had before around 250 tanks per regiment, now you have something like maybe 200, maybe 180. But 180 is not half of 250. So yes, they reduced the amount of tanks and they reduced the amount of battalions, but at the same time the tanks became better and the battalions became bigger. So that's just not true. That was not halving the amount of strength of the panzer divisions. Actually, from the pure firepower perspective, they were actually much better than before, because now they had actually more of the good stuff. The Panzer Is and the Panzer IIs were still in there in very small numbers. The Panzer II was still used, but mostly as a reconnaissance vehicle. The Panzer I almost didn't exist anymore, when before it had actually made up to 20% of the entire tank force. So that is a complete myth, just looking at the amount of battalions. That's not how you can look at it. I have the numbers here. I know exactly the amount of tanks that was in every panzer division. And I can actually give you maybe even a quick excerpt just to give you a quick comparison. So let's look at what it looked like in France. So let me look into this. Where do I have France? This is Poland. Let's see, maybe we should just go for the 1st or 4th or something like that. Panzer divisions, those were pretty typical usually. So... oh, this is reserving. Just give me a second here. So the major myth that they basically were halved is completely wrong. And if I give you the numbers now, you're going to see that that's not even close. So for example, the 1st Panzer Division, which was actually one of the better ones, like the 1st Regiment of 1st Panzer Division had 26 Panzer Is, 49 Panzer IIs, 28 Panzer IIIs and 20 Panzer IVs. That was a pretty good division, right? Well, there were also divisions that had much less, that only had 20 Panzer IIIs. We remember in Poland they had almost no Panzer IIIs. Some divisions actually did not have any Panzer IIIs. So you had around 20 of those, 20 Panzer IVs, and then you had like 50 Panzer IIs and almost 30 Panzer Is. You can clearly see, okay, yeah, there seems to be a large majority of Panzer Is and IIs here. Now we're gonna look at Barbarossa. Now we suddenly have a situation where 1st Panzer Division 1st Regiment has 43 Panzer IIs still, but 71 Panzer IIIs with 5cm gun, and still 20 Panzer IVs. So we went from 20 Panzer IIIs, or 28 Panzer IIIs, up to 71. I don't think that is actually less, because of course, yeah, in this case, Panzer I, the 1st Panzer Division only has 1 regiment and 2 battalions anymore. But if I add up the amount of Panzer IIIs before, I get to 58 Panzer IIIs with 2 regiments, and now they had 71 with 1 regiment. How is that halving the strength? That's actually increasing the strength by quite an amount. Or am I the only one seeing that? On top of this, a Panzer Division is not just made out of tanks. They realized that the Panzer divisions in France were still kind of tank heavy. That's why they reduced the amount of panzers, and they actually increased the amount of infantry. They got an additional battalion of infantry, and they got an additional battalion of artillery. The heavy artillery, the 15cm gun, most of the Panzer divisions still didn't have that in France. They added that for Barbarossa, so every Panzer division had an additional heavy artillery battalion. How does that reduce the firepower? On top of that, the existing infantry units doubled the amount of machine guns that they had. When one company before had 9 machine guns, now they had 18 machine guns. They also changed around some other heavy equipment, but in total, the Panzer divisions of 1941 were way more battle effective than the Panzer divisions in 1940. Anybody that says anything different has no idea what they're talking about. That is just completely untrue, and it's complete garbage, and even the best historians are still quoting it. But if you actually look into the numbers, it's completely wrong, and sometimes those historians even say so later in their own books when they previously had made that claim in the same book. I do not understand that, but it's just completely wrong. It's just something that keeps getting copy and pasted and nobody actually looks into it. But the data is completely clear. You can look into it. I posted more sources than enough. We may even later look into the actual setup. I think you actually gave me one here. Yeah, this thing that Brock here posted. Let me actually look into the glossary.
And I can absolutely agree that the 41 divisions are super efficient compared to the ones we had in France.
Yeah, that's just not true that was the case. If you look at, let me actually go here. Let's go for 1940 and let's go for 1941. And like in 1940, let's pick, 4th Panzer Division, and let's pick in 41 also 4th Panzer Division. So you can clearly see these triangle flags. Those are battalions. So we clearly have 4 of those, right? We have 2 regiments with 4 battalion each, but look at the number of companies. We have 3 companies in every battalion. Now look at this. Now we only have 2 battalions, but we have 4 companies in each of the battalions. That's not the same kind of battalion. And each of those light companies now has way more Panther IIIs that they had before. So the amount of Panther IIIs in this regiment went up, not down. On top of this, let's look at the infantry. Here, this already had 4 infantry battalions. There's no Kreuzschützen unit in here, right? Now let's look at this. We still have 4 battalions of infantry, but now we have an additional battalion of Kreuzschützen, so we have 1 more infantry battalion. And then look at this. Some of these battalions even just had 2 companies. Okay, they have 1 more motorcycle company, but that was 3 companies. Now here they suddenly have 4 with 1 heavy weapons company that got extracted out of the other company. On top of this, here, okay, in this case, that one regiment already has made the switch, but look at the left regiment. 9 light machine guns, 2 heavy machine guns, which is just the same machine gun, just on a mounting. 1941, 18 light machine guns, And in some cases, they later have 4 heavy machine guns. For some reason, this hasn't changed here. Some divisions did that, so this is obviously not fully upgraded yet. The actual later equipment is 18 light machine guns and 4 heavy machine guns per company. So this went up a large amount. Let's look at the artillery. Here we have 2 battalions of 10.5 artillery. Let's look at 1941. Now we have 2 battalions of 10.5 artillery and 1 battalion of 15 centimeter artillery. Now tell me, does this look like a less effective division to you? Doesn't to me. This looks like way more effective. And it was. It was probably the most effective panzer divisions the German had at any point in the war. Maybe 1942 is arguably a little bit better. Arguably. It's a little, they had a little bit better stuff. They switched around a couple of things, but the major transition to the layout of a very effective panzer division has happened by now. By now, after this, they just get a little bit better equipment, but the layout of the thing is basically finished. This is basically the perfect layout, and they're going to keep doing this and just upgrade their equipment. But the layout basically doesn't change anymore after this, at least not in any good sense. Later, they reduced the amount of battalions again and all that, but at that point, they do that because they don't have the stuff anymore, and not because they want to. But yeah, this number of tanks in the division is halved. That's just wrong. No, Game On. Even the pure number is not halved. At best, it's 60%. And that's the worst I could come up with. Most of them still have 70% of what they had before, or even 80% of what they had before. Yes, they reduced the amount of tanks, but not by 50%. Much less than that. At most 40%, but most of the time not even that. And that's not a reduction that they did because they didn't have the tanks. It's a reduction that they know they can do because initially they had so many tanks because they knew the tanks were not going to be that effective. Now that they actually have the number of tanks, they can reduce the numbers. And those were the planned numbers that were there right from the start. In 1939, they already planned divisions that only had Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, with a couple of Panzer IIs for recon. Of course, they didn't have the production, so they filled it up with Panzer Is and Panzer IIs, and then they put up a couple more in there because obviously those tanks are not as effective. But the lower numbers were planned in the original conception of the Panzer Division already in 1936 almost. That is not something that they did later because they didn't have the tanks and they needed to reduce them to get more Panzer divisions going. That's complete garbage. They went to the layout that they initially had conceived anyway because now they actually had the tanks to do it with, and they switched it a little bit around. They reduced the tanks a little bit more because they wanted to increase the infantry to tank ratio. That's why they reduced a couple of these tanks. They wanted more infantry, less tanks, because that was the better mix. Not because they didn't have the machines, because it was the better mix. Otherwise, they wouldn't have increased the infantry. They needed more infantry. They had noticed, and there are after-action reports where you can see that they say we still do not have enough infantry support for the tanks. We're still having problems with certain terrain. We need more infantry support for the tanks. We still have problems with the tanks going in there alone and taking heavy losses. And that's exactly what happened with the French. Their tanks got constantly separated from the infantry and took heavy losses. That is something that needs to happen. The infantry needs to be in close support of the tanks at all times, otherwise the tanks are going to take losses. And the Germans managed to do that and pull it off with the proper mixture, and 1941 Panzer divisions were really good. And they had to be good. If you look into in what state the Panzer divisions were shortly before attacking Moscow, they basically were at sometimes 30% of everything, and they still were able to somehow pull off an offensive. You cannot do that with a unit that is not effective. That has to say something about the effectiveness of these divisions, if at that strength level they can still pull offensive operations off. Okay, so much about that. What else? There was one more thing, I think. Oh yeah, I kind of talked about that already. The omnipresence of the Luftwaffe. Yeah, I already said around Smolensk, that was basically over. The first couple weeks, the Germans actually managed to take out the vast majority of the Soviet Air Force that was actually at the front, at the frontal sectors, and had for a short amount of time air superiority in those sectors. But when they pushed further, all the aircraft in the rear areas, remember they had several tens of thousands of these things, got pulled off the front, off the rear areas and put to the front, and at that point they outnumbered the Germans again, and also the front of the German army became wider and wider and wider, and the Luftwaffe just couldn't cover all that area. So in certain areas the Germans didn't have air superiority, not even close. In Smolensk the Russians had complete air superiority, not just a air advantage, they had complete supremacy in several sectors. There was not a German plane anywhere in sight. The Soviets could basically do whatever they wanted. So that the Germans had complete air superiority all along the front in 1941 is not true. In some areas, the Soviets had complete air supremacy, and the Germans couldn't do anything about it. So that is also a major myth, but I talked about that a little bit earlier. So I wanted to put those out of the way because it's stuff that gets repeated all over and all over and all over again in all kinds of books, and it's just completely wrong. There were no Soviet Siberian divisions. Having the tank forces is complete nonsense. They actually increased the amount of firepower that those divisions had and the effectiveness that they had. The 37 centimeter PaK was not completely inefficient, quite the opposite. It was very useful. It just didn't work against KVs and T-34s, but those made up only 9% of the total tank force. And this air supremacy stuff is just not true. The Air Force was not capable of pulling it off, not because it wasn't good enough, but because the front was just too large. Just to enhance on that Air Force argument, which already shows you again what the kind of supply thinking here was, or the kind of strategic thinking was. In 1941, the orders to the Luftwaffe were basically to keep up the fight with the British, both over mainland Britain and in North Africa, as they had done in 1940, at the same strength and intensiveness, and on top of that, support the effort of Barbarossa and make sure that success is possible. The Air Force in 1940 was already taking so many losses, especially in the Battle of France, that they had big trouble keeping up the pressure on Great Britain. Now, on top of that, you're not only to keep that going, you're now supposed to, on top of that, support Operation Barbarossa. And someone thinks that's actually a good idea. Just putting that out there. So, yeah, I think that's it. And then I think if there are no questions about that, we can immediately jump into the 1942 layout, because I kind of already talked about it. I mean, I didn't show the 1942 layout yet, but I already talked about the changes of 40 to 41. So let's see what the changes were to 42. And you can see here there's no longer a list of Panzer divisions. So by 1942, they pretty much had standardized the Panzer divisions. So at that point, the layout is pretty much identical. At least the layout that they're supposed to have. In practice, there's still differences, but the actual...
There are huge differences. Yeah. I sent you the link with the actual tanks they have.
Yeah, that is, of course, naturally going to happen, especially at a time where you got almost your entire Army Group Center wiped out. You're not going to be able to bring everything onto the standard stuff, but at least the idea on what a Panzer division is supposed to look like, that was completely standardized. And at this point, every Panzer division was supposed to look like this. Obviously, that never happened during the war, but I don't think that happened in any country. That's obviously not doable at a time of war, but that was the ideal setup. And you can see it was supposed to have 3 battalions at this point. Again, but only with 3 companies. Again, they split it up again. More battalions, less companies. That makes a difference. It's still the same amount of tanks, but you split them up in a different command structure, and that can give you more flexibility. because you can use these battalions independently. So that makes a difference on a tactical level, even though the total number of tanks is the same. So just because the battalions are more doesn't mean there's more tanks, and the same the other way around. You need to, it's mostly just switching up the command structure to make it more flexible in one way or another. That's usually what happens here. It's not actually that the total firepower changes in any way. You're just switching stuff around a little bit. So that's what happened there. Of course, they get different tanks, and I can quickly go into that, what that actually looked like. Not even sure is that actually in here. Should be still in this book. We get a lot of Panther 3s that now have the long 5 centimeter already, but not a huge amount of stuff. We also are starting to get some of the Panzer 4s that now have the long gun going, but not all of them already. For example, I can give you, let's say, for example, the 4th Panzer Division now has 28 Panther 3s with the short 5 centimeter. So the 3.7 centimeter Panzer 3s are completely gone by this point. You have only the 5 centimeter gun. But now you have the long 5 centimeter and the short 5 centimeter. The long 5 centimeter, I think that is the Panther 3 J1. And then the L models. I think those are the models that have that long 5 centimeter gun. It should very much reflect in the heart attack value. I think the J1 is the first one, and then the L. Most of them don't have the long one yet. There's a couple of Panzer divisions that have a lot of those still. For example, the 11th Panzer Division has only 14 Panther 3s with short 5 centimeter, and already 110 Panther 3s with the long 5 centimeter gun. Has only 1 Panzer IV with the short gun, and already 12 Panzer IVs with the long gun. So you see, yeah, the L60, exactly, Carol, that's the long 5 centimeter. So you can see that 11th Panzer Division was probably going to be used heavily in the summer offensive because it has pretty good stuff. Well, the 12th Panzer Division, for example, only has 2 battalions and only 48 Panther 3s short, and only 6 Panzer IV corps short, and 4 Panzer IVs long. So you can see that this is almost not a Panzer Division. They're like 50 Panther 3s and not even, like 10 Panzer IVs. Obviously, that's not going to be useful much. So you can see here already they're cannibalizing certain Panzer divisions to put certain others in action. The 1st Panzer Division is down to 1 battalion with 2 Panzer IIs, 10 Panzer 38Ts, 26 Panther 3s with the short centimeter, and the 7 Panzer IVs with the short gun. So again, that Panzer Division is completely non-effective. It's not going to do anything. So you can see that all the Panzer divisions of Army Group North and Center are basically cannibalized, and they're trying to put everything into the Panzer divisions that are going to be used in Army Group South and make those effective. So you have very differing strengths here in the Panzer divisions, but you have to basically look at the ones that are going to be used in the South if you want to know what a Panzer division will look like that we're going to use, because we're obviously going to be on the attack. We're not going to be along the front in Army Group Center and basically not do anything. So it really depends on what you actually look at. Let me actually look into this. So in Army Group South, we actually have the 16th Panzer Division, the 22nd, the 14th, the 3rd, the 23rd, and the 13th, the 9th, the 11th. Again, that's why the 11th is so strong, because it's going to be used. The 24th, and that's pretty much it. Everything else, the 8th, the 12th, the 4th, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, the 1st, the 5th, the 20th, and the 2nd were all used in Army Group Center and North. So those are going to be way weaker than anything else. And those are not the ones that we should use to compare us. So most of the Panzer divisions that we named us after, we should probably not model after, because those were not used in the summer offensive. Those are naturally going to be way weaker than anything we can use. Those are not something we can model after. We need to model after Panzer divisions that were used in the summer offensive. because the other ones are going to be basically completely useless because they're completely cannibalized, because Germany does not have enough stuff to equip all the Panzer divisions that they have anymore. Completely gone, 37mm is not totally right. They were still used well into 44. Well, yes, technically the gun is not gone. I'm talking about Panther 3s using the gun. Those are gone from the Panzer divisions. Let me actually look. Do I find anyone that is still using it? I mean, there's other tanks still using it. For example, the Panther 30AT is obviously still using it, and the anti-tank guns are obviously still using it. But the tanks that used it, I think those are completely gone. I can't find a single division here that is still using it. And I have the numbers that each of these divisions had. I cannot find a single Panther 3 that has not been upgraded. Panther 30ATs, obviously, because those never got a different gun. Those are obviously going to still use it. But I also suspect that none of the divisions that were still using the 30AT were actually used in the summer offensive. So I think we can get rid of those, because all of those were either in Army Group Center or North. I would be highly surprised if they used any of those tanks in the summer offensive. I really don't think so. No, not just in security formations. They also used them in regular Panzer divisions. But as I said, they used those in Army Group Center and North and Center didn't attack. They were basically just holding the line. So they didn't need anything good there. Those were just to be able to react to counterattacks and push the Soviets back. That was all they were supposed to do. But they were not supposed to go on offensive operations because they wouldn't have been able to. They didn't have enough stuff. So, but it's pretty obvious when I look at these things. A division that was going to be used in the summer offensive was 11th Panzer Division. And the 11th Panzer Division had 15 Panzer IIs, so almost none anymore. 14 Panther 3s with the short gun, 110 Panzer 3s with the long gun, so almost all Panther 3s in that division have the long gun already. Only one Panzer 4 with the short gun, and already 12 Panzer 4s with the long gun, so even the Panzer 4s have been already upgraded to the long gun. Let me check which ones were used also, give you another example. So this was the 11th that was used. Then, for example, the 16th Panzer Division was also used. Let's look at that one. 16th Panzer Division had 13 Panzer IIs, 39 Panther 3s with the short gun, 18 Panther 3s with the long gun, 15 Panther 4s with the short gun, and 12 Panzer 4s with the long gun. So that was more in an immediate state. Not everything is upgraded yet, but about half of each type of tank has already been upgraded to the long gun. I'll give you another example. 14th Panzer Division, for example, was used. Let's look at that one. Those had, again, 14 Panzer IIs, so very little, about less than 20. Around 15 Panzer IIs were only still in the Panzer Division. And those were usually probably in the light battalions, which were only used for recon stuff and staff protection. So those were not really used in any offensive operations anymore. So we don't even need to think about those. Then we have 41 Panzer 3s with the short gun, 19 Panzer 3s with the long gun, 20 Panzer 4s with the short gun, and 4 Panzer 4s with the long gun. So again, about 50-50, a little less in this case, of slowly upgrading. So I would say, for us, since we have, almost all of them have 3 battalions, the ones that were used on the offensives, the other sometimes only have 1 battalion left. So again, these are completely cannibalized. Those we don't need to look at because we're not going to play a division with just 1 battalion, obviously. We can have 3 Panzer units per division still. That's exactly what we have here. And I think we can give us about 50-50 of the Panther 3s should be short gun, long gun, and about 50-50 of the Panzer 4s should be short gun, long gun. Since we only have 1 Panzer 4 per division, one of them should have a short gun, the other one should have a long gun. And since we have 2 Panther 3s in each division, each division should have one Panzer III with the short gun and one Panzer III with the long gun, basically. That's basically what it should look like. 38Ts, all that stuff, completely out the window. Those were not the kind of tanks that were attacking towards Stalingrad. They were an Army Group Center in North. We can completely neglect those. Even if our numbered divisions, the 7th, the 8th, the 1st, and the 4th, may have looked like that, yes, but those were not used in the Southern Offensive. So what those looked like is basically not relevant at this time anymore. Unfortunately, basically exactly those divisions that we picked were an Army Group Center and were almost wiped out. So obviously they're going to pick the Army Group South tanks. Why? Well, that's where Army Group South didn't get the majority of the counterattacks. The major counterattacks of the Soviets happened in the north and in the center. So Army Group South didn't have as much opposition in the first place. They didn't have any counterattacks on that scale happening, so their panzer divisions were mostly still intact. So obviously that's where you're going to push them and build them up and add a little more, and then you want to attack in that direction anyway, so that's the way to do it. The Soviets expected Army Group Center to be rebuilt. That's why they put most of their offensives in 1942 in that direction, and that's also where most of their counterattacks happened. That's why the Germans made such a huge advantage initially, because the Soviets didn't expect them to attack that way, which is kind of ironic. In 1941, Stalin expected them to attack in the south, and then they attacked in the center. In 1942, he expected them to attack in the center, and then they attacked in the south. So yeah, Stalin was basically wrong every time. But that's how that happened. So yes, Brock, again, we should have about 5 infantry units, 6 panzer units. Half of the Panzer IIIs should be short gun, long gun. Half of the Panzer IVs should be short gun, long gun.
Yeah, I will probably not care and at the moment upgrade all to the newest models regarding the tanks and then keep them as is, because I don't want to recheck all the time.
You can do that because, again, if we consider us to be the absolute elite panzer divisions, there were divisions like that. If you look at 11th Panzer Divisions,
I've going to say looked it up.
Yeah, I'm going to say it again. 11th Panzer Division had absolutely 90% of its tanks already with the long guns, both for Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. They only had 1 Panzer IV with the short gun left, and they only had 14 Panzer IIIs with the short gun left. They had 110 with the long gun and 12 Panzer IVs with the long gun. So we can absolutely
outdated during the course of the Grand Campaign anyways. So
yeah, absolutely. And they will make the transition towards the long gun for everything. They got upgraded over time. Just this is the strength that they had initially when they started the offensive.
Think about when to do it, and I simply don't want to think about that.
Yeah, there's definitely
then I potentially switch my Panzer IIIs to Panzer IVs and the other way around again.
yeah, definitely. We have to look into this from that perspective. I'm probably not going to upgrade them right away to all of that, but I'm going to do it definitely before we hit Stalingrad. And then we need to look at some point switching one Panzer III to a Panzer IV, because in 1940, the transition happened of the Panzer IV taking the role of the Panzer III. So eventually, there's going to be 2 Panzer IVs, 1 Panzer III in our division, instead of the other way around. But that can happen, basically. I wouldn't do it right away, because that would not be realistic. But around, I guess, halfway through the campaign.
Yeah, I will see if new models come along. That's a good opportunity to do it.
We should also be able to use mortars now in
I looked it up, but it's different. Some the 8th, for example, has a mortar. The 10th, on the other hand, has only towed anti-tank units, so they had 5 centimeter, and some of them only had 3.6 or 3.9 centimeter guns. So yeah, it's very mixed.
Yeah, I'm gonna look into it. Maybe I'm gonna immediately upgrade to all mortars. Maybe I'm just gonna upgrade 1 to mortar and keep 1
I will
towed.
go half because it's very mixed, and I don't want to have everything as mobile anti-tank because I simply want to have the towed guns around.
Yeah, I'm probably going exactly the opposite direction. I'm going to keep half with the tanks and upgrade all the stuff to mortars. So I'm probably going to take that route. But yeah, we should definitely not upgrade everything to the newest stuff. That would not be realistic. So I'm going to not upgrade. I'm going to upgrade the anti-tank and not upgrade all the tanks. I'm going to go that route. Otherwise,
the only thing I didn't find out is the mobile anti-air units. Because now the regular anti-aircraft cannon seems to be the 88, supported by smaller guns, but all are towed.
Well, yeah, that's what's the one thing to mention. They actually added the 88 units as the regular, well, not as the regular, as an additional anti-aircraft unit, but now they added it to the actual division. So now it's basically just a natural development. Most of the tank divisions got 88s assigned to them for special purposes anyway, and they turned out to be so useful that somebody said, why don't we put some of those directly into the division anyway? If they're going to be attached to them all the time anyway, let's just put them directly under their command. So you have some 20 millimeters and some 88 millimeter guns there. They're all motorized. Some of them, however, are self-propelled. I can't give you exact numbers about that.
Well, I looked at exact those layouts you have on the screen for each of the divisions, and some of them really have almost all 88 guns, but I found practically no self-propelled anti-aircraft cannons.
Well, if you look at this, if I click on this unit, that is an anti-aircraft company. The other ones are anti-tank companies. So the anti-aircraft stuff is actually part of the anti-tank.
Yeah, but this is a 20 millimeter.
Yeah, this is a 20 millimeter anti-aircraft company. However, you can see there is, despite it's being named that, you also have some 3.7 centimeter self-propelled flak in here. And I'm pretty sure if they're not in this unit, there are going to be in other layouts. There are going to be attached 88 somewhere. And in this thing...
No, they are on the artillery level. You have to go back.
Right. Yeah, the 88 is actually attached to the artillery. Yeah.
You have to go back and to the artillery section, yeah.
Yes. There's actually where the 88s are supposed to be. There's two battalions or two batteries of 88, and there's another battery towed 20 millimeter. But what I'm saying is, if you look at the anti-tank battalion, there is now a self-propelled anti-aircraft company. So, okay, this is not a battalion.
No, it's towed. Motor towed.
No. This is self-propelled. The one in the artillery is towed. If you look...
I don't see it in real time, so we are talking...
Yeah, down in the anti-tank battalion, there is a self-propelled anti-aircraft company. And if you look into that, you see the individual vehicles. And there you see there's some 2 centimeter self-propelled flags and even some 37 centimeter, 3.7 centimeter flag self-propelled. So, okay, this is just one company, so it depends. But since we don't even have any anti-aircraft units right now in our units, we could say, okay, let's combine this the 20 millimeter towed from up there with the self-propelled 20 millimeter, and let's say, okay, that's kind of enough to justify putting a unit in there. So we could have 1 or 2 self-propelled anti-aircraft units at this point, plus the 88s. I still think we should only have 188, but maybe you put 2 in there. I don't really care. We could do that, but I think we should probably not have 2 88s and 2 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, so we have either one of the other and 2 of the other, or the other way around. So either 2 88s and 1 self-propelled, or 2 self-propelled and 1 88. I think that can be justified.
Yeah, I agree. And Damon, you're right. I might actually upgrade Kiasha immediately to a Panzer IV, so I don't have to double
Yeah, I was
upgrade him.
exactly.
That's
I'm
a good idea.
I'm thinking about doing something like that with the hero unit as well to avoid some later upgrades.
He is still a 38T, and yeah, making a Panzer 3 for a couple of missions seems to be a little bit of a waste.
Yeah. And again, this transition is supposed to happen anyway. They can already see that. And it's not happening yet, but if you're doing it already, just because that just makes sense for upgrade purposes, it's still justified. This transition is going to happen over the course of the year. The Panzer IV is going to take the role of the Panzer III. At some points, we actually have both the Panzer III and the Panzer IV as strong anti-tank units. The Panzer IV is, I think, going to be a little bit better, but the Panzer III is still not going to be a slouch.
The L versions are extremely good, actually.
Yeah, there is later going to be a Panzer III model that is actually more of a infantry attack tank that has better soft attack, much less hard attack. That was used at that point, and there's a reason for it. Again, the Panzer IV doesn't have the support gun anymore. It's the actual anti-tank gun. And at this point, there was a little bit of a development. This long 75 that the Panzer IV was getting was so effective, and there were so many Russian tanks coming up, that Hitler basically ordered that 75 centimeter gun and even the long 5 centimeter gun to be put on basically everything. So be put on the recon cars, be put on the Stuks. This is also when that transition from the Stuks happened, where the Stuks were no longer artillery, but suddenly they were tank hunters. All of that was happening, and now the infantry was complaining that they didn't have the support guns anymore, because that's actually what made the infantry very effective, because they had those armored vehicles that gave them fire support. Now all of those guys were tank hunters, and they didn't have those effective howitzers anymore. That's why they asked those guns to come back, and then those short guns actually got mounted on the recon cars and on the Panther III again. So there was actually support vehicles again, because the Stuks were no longer actually supporting the infantry. They were now hunting tanks. So that transition happened here. That's why that Panzer III came into existence. Whether we make that switch or not, it's kind of up to us, because soon after that we're gonna have the next switch: 2 Panthers, 1 Panzer IV. So I mean, it's an in-family upgrade, so we can still do it before we switch that Panzer III to a Panther. Because obviously one of the Panzer IVs that we already upgraded, we're going to keep as the additional support Panzer IV. We're not going to upgrade that into a Panther and upgrade the Panther III into a 4. That would be 3 upgrades. That would be stupid. So whether we make that in-family upgrade or not, I'm not even sure how long we'll keep that before we make the transition to the Panther. It's probably not going to be very long. But it's probably going to be a cheap upgrade, so we can decide, do we want the additional soft attack, or do we just keep it as a strong hard attack tank? It's basically up to us. I don't think every Panzer divisions did that transition anyway, so it's basically up to us whether we want to try that thing out or not. It's just one model anyway. It's the N model. After that, there's no more Panther 3s. I think there's one additional model after that, but that's going to be, again, a anti-tank model. So the M, I think. Which one of those two we use is basically up to us. Do we want more soft attack, or do we want more hard attack? That basically doesn't really matter. It's very close to the end of the lifetime of the Panther 3 anyway.
Yep. So basically I have everything set for my core.
Yeah, pretty sure I have mine set up for Demyansk also. By the way, in case anybody wonders about Demyansk, I didn't put that in here on any map because that's already 1942. But that's basically a result of the counterattack after the attack of Moscow failed. I think on E-series, here you can clearly see it. Autumn 1942? No, that's autumn 1941. I think this should be. Let me check here. That's Vyazma counterattack. Almost all these guys got surrounded here. But that never happened. Let me see. Somewhere you can see there was Demyansk for a short moment. Down there, that's Demyansk down there. You can see Novgorod. That's where you attacked Bruk. That's that lake south of Novgorod. And Demyansk is basically down there. I think that's still Army Group Center. Maybe it's still Army Group North. I'm not sure. I think it's Army Group North, actually. And you can see, I think, somewhere on here where that pocket developed. Yeah, here. Let me move here. There you can see. That's where that front line developed and trapped the Demyansk area. That's basically what we're playing. That was basically just a pocket developing thanks to the Soviet counterattack in the north. That pocket eventually got liberated. That pocket was actually entirely supplied from the air. That was happening, so that thing with the air transports that need to get in there, that's realistic, that got supplied from the air. Later they actually said this might have been a giant waste of time because they lost a lot of transport planes to do this, and of the 60, I'm not even sure, of the 90,000 troops that were in there, I believe like 10,000 made it out in still a fighting condition. So was it really worth doing this? Yeah, I think they only managed to get them out in 1943, so this pocket lasted for quite a while. Yeah, also some historians believe that the success, in quotes, success, of keeping these units supplied from the air later gave them the idea that they could pull the same off at Stalingrad, although that was obviously a major, larger scale. Like this was 90,000 troops, that was 300,000, plus the Romanian units that were in there, so I'm not even sure what the total number was. Yeah, not really, and they lost a large number of transport planes here already, so that was probably not going to be a good idea, but this might have given them the idea that that might work, because it kind of worked here. So that had kind of, yeah, an impact on later on the war. Otherwise, yeah, these guys got basically stuck there until early 1943, I think. Then they got broken out, but by that time, anybody that was in there was basically not in fighting condition anymore. So, yeah, they got them out, but yeah, most of them were not useful to the front anymore at that point. So, yeah, these counterattacks were brutal. I'm actually kind of sad that we don't have to face the major brunt of the attack in some scenario, because yeah, that Soviet counterattack was actually a big deal. So I would have actually liked to have seen a kind of big defensive battle in front of Moscow around the Vyazma area, because that's where almost entire Army Group Center got encircled. That's actually where Guderian was relieved of command, by the way, because he panicked and yeah, wanted to retreat when absolutely this front needed to be held. Otherwise, a total disaster might have happened. And yeah, that was the end of Guderian's career as a frontline commander. Was that the one where they airlifted in prototype Stugs? I don't know. Never read anything about that. I just know they tried to keep them basically...
No, not Stugs, the Sturmgewehre.
Oh, no, I don't believe so. The first kind of Sturmgewehr was delivered to the troops in 1944. I don't think in 1943 or 42 there was any such thing as a Sturmgewehr. The first Sturmgewehr...
He means Stugs. I'm not sure.
No, he just said prototype Sturmgewehr. I don't think so. If anything, well, because the first Sturmgewehr was basically called MP44. So... MKB42, oh, that thing. Oh, that is a very early thing. I wouldn't even call that a prototype Sturmgewehr. That was a thing that was... I'm not even sure. Is that even a part of the Sturmgewehr development? There was another kind of automatic reloading gun that was more that was a different line of development of gun. I think that was the MKB. I think that was not the Sturmgewehr line of development. I think that was a completely different gun. So I don't know whether they received that one. I don't have any sources on that. Could be. I don't know. All I know is that they basically had to supply them with everything, basically, because there was no land connection until early 1943. And again, that holding that pocket, probably wasn't a good idea. It should have surrendered maybe, or pulled them out, but they were supposed to hold, I don't know. There was a lot of decisions of holding a lot of ground that probably shouldn't have been held. In front of Smolensk, there was also a major bulge in the front line that the army absolutely wanted to hold as a launching point towards Vyazma, and that area was basically almost impossible to hold. The try to hold it basically cost them huge amounts of losses, and in the end they had to give it up anyway. So that was probably a major blunder, especially Guderian never wanted to give it up, but it cost them a huge amount of losses and it didn't amount to anything. So some of this stuff should have been given up earlier, but they just did not believe that the time for offensives was over. They thought, now we need to hold that because it's going to be launching point for the next offensive, and the next offensive is going to win the war. They always thought the next offensive was going to win the war, and that just didn't happen because the Soviet army actually grew after every offensive, funnily enough. But of course they didn't know that. And of course, at some point they kept, doubting their intelligence, because every time they kept saying, okay, yeah, they have so many divisions. Once we wipe those out, and they're just ad hoc divisions. They don't have any good equipment, which at some points was true, but you still, 5 million men are still 5 million men, whether they have good stuff or not. They were always just said, yeah, this is the last remnant of stuff that's just old men and children that they scrounged up. If we take those out, it's going to be over. And then you take them out, they're actually not old men and children, and then suddenly there are more divisions behind them. At some point you start asking yourself, like, are you guys pulling our legs here, or what's going on? So yes, they just never stopped coming, and the Germans had no idea where these troops all were coming from, because nobody in the world had any idea that the Soviets had this capability of producing so many troops in such a short amount of time, because basically nobody in the world was so crazy to believe that they needed to replace their entire army in the course of every half year. But the Soviets not only believed that, they were actually capable of doing that, which says a lot about their thinking what modern war was going to be like. And to their credit, that's actually what it was like. And they were able to, thanks to this doctrine, to win the war. Otherwise, if they had just had a standing army of 5 million and nothing in the reserve, they would have been wiped out in 1941, because the Germans did wipe out the entire Red Army. It's just that the Soviets were able to replace the entire army many times over. Because the Germans basically wiped out 5 million troops every year. Every year of the war. For 4 years, they basically wiped out 4 million or so every year. That makes 4 times 3 years. Yeah, for 1945, you can't even count anymore. That nothing really happened anymore in that year. But if you take the major years of the war, 1941, 1942, and 1943, they wiped out 4 million in each one of those, and that makes up for the 12 million losses that the Soviets had. So if you wipe out 4 million troops every year over 3 years and you still don't win, you're actually losing. Yeah. Then tell me how you're going to defeat that kind of enemy. They should never have attacked this in the first place. There was actually one of the studies that they initially made with this. There was actually a follow-up study that made the actual strategic analysis, and they actually said, wait a second, we're getting most of our equipment, most of our food from the Soviet Union. We're getting most of our oil from the Soviet Union. So basically every kind of resource that we're actually trying to conquer from the Soviet Union, they are right now giving us for trade. So Why exactly are we attacking them? So this entire idea on knocking out the last hope for the British and that kind of thing, that was just, that just didn't make any sense whatsoever, because those resources were already coming from Russia in a peaceful agreement, and Stalin had absolutely no interest in attacking. He was actually shocked that the Germans won so quickly in the West, because he was actually completely for a long war in the West. That all those fascist and capitalist nations were gonna kill each other, and then the only thing left would be the Soviet Union. Yeah, but then it was over after 6 weeks. Oh, bummer. That's not what Stalin wanted. So he was not interested in facing Hitler, especially since the rearmament program was not done at this point. There was a huge rearmament program, a huge restructuring program, plus the purchase of all the officers and all that stuff. So all this rearmament, restructuring, removing of stuff, establishing new defensive structures and new defensive lines and new doctrines, new strategies, all that was still in motion at this very time. Had the Germans attacked 1 year earlier or 1 year later, they would have had a much harder time. At this point, that was the most unstable situation for the Red Army, because they were completely in a state of transition. So it was actually the best time they could have attacked. But didn't help them in the end, which already shows you that, if they didn't win now, they were just basically never going to win.
I have to stop you for a moment, because I have to stop my part of the stream. Well, I'm not streaming, but I have to leave now.
Yeah, we can basically call it quits, because I think we have covered everything. So in case there's no more questions in the chat, because I also don't want to pull this off for too long. So Forgotten Weapons, those channels, World War II live channel, I can only recommend those. Lots of more information there. Obviously also the Chieftain. And I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I'm gonna say we're gonna call it a night. We streamed long enough anyway. Over almost 4 hours again.
Yep. I'm completely exhausted now.
Yeah, and it's hot like hell in my room here, because my god, this summer is so hot.
Me too.
So
I really need to stop. So yeah, thanks for watching, everyone, and see you at, well, I forgot how my next mission actually is.
I totally forgot anyway. I still need to play Demian's Pocket, but yeah, see you in 1942, whatever it is. Yep. Yeah. So
yeah, have a nice day or night, and see you next time.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye bye. Keep your heads up, folks. We'll see you on the next one in 1942.